Long before the marble columns of the Parthenon rose beneath the clear blue skies of Attica, and long before the voices of philosophers echoed through shaded courtyards in Athens, the land that would become ancient Greece lay cradled between mountains and sea, shaped by rocky coastlines and sun-bleached hills. It was a region where the boundaries of land and water blurred, dotted with countless islands and edged by deep bays, coves, and inlets. This fragmented geography did more than sculpt the scenery. It shaped the very way of life that would emerge here, encouraging independence, seafaring, and the formation of small, self-contained communities. These early settlements would become the seeds of powerful city-states, but their roots reached back even farther, into a past where myth and history gently intertwine. The story of ancient Greece begins in the shadowy corridors of prehistory, with the mysterious Minoans of Crete and the warlike Mycenaeans of the mainland. The Minoans, who flourished around 2000 BCE, built elaborate palaces like the one at Knossos, a sprawling labyrinthine structure with graceful frescoes of dolphins and dancers, symbols of a peaceful and refined society. They left behind no written stories that we can read, only the undeciphered script known as Linear A and the silent testimony of their art. But their influence rippled outward. Across the sea and through the centuries, the Mycenaeans rose, taking inspiration from Minoan culture, but turning it toward a more martial spirit. With fortified citadels and gold-laden tombs, they ruled from strongholds like Mycenae, where the Lion Gate still stands, a monumental entrance flanked by stone lions that have watched over the ruins for more than 3,000 years. These early civilizations fell into decline around 1200 BCE, during a wider collapse that shook the eastern Mediterranean. What followed was a period of obscurity sometimes called the Greek Dark Age, where large-scale building ceased and writing seemed to disappear. But even in quiet times, seeds continued to grow, small villages held on, oral traditions preserved stories that would one day become epic poems. The land remained, waiting. Slowly, the flicker of civilization returned, and by the 8th century BCE, something new was stirring, a cultural rebirth that would shape the world. Out of this reawakening came the city-states, or polis, of the Archaic period. Independent and often rivalrous, they formed wherever land allowed, in valleys, on hillsides, and along the coasts. Among them rose names that would echo through time: Corinth, Thebes, Delphi, and Athens. These cities were not merely political units, but living expressions of their people's values. Some were known for wealth, others for military strength, and some, like Athens, would come to embody a spirit of intellectual and artistic curiosity that defined a golden age. But long before these cities reached their peak, the Greeks began to look outward. The sea, always present, was a natural highway. Greek ships set sail across the Aegean and beyond, founding colonies as far west as Spain and as far east as the Black Sea. They brought with them their language, their gods, and their customs, but each colony adapted to its own surroundings, forming a kind of extended Greek world, united by culture, yet wonderfully diverse. This expansion helped spread ideas and trade, but it also brought new challenges. Identity became a question. What made someone Greek? It was not empire, nor a single ruler. Instead, it was shared language, shared stories, shared rituals, and a deep reverence for the gods. In the early sanctuaries of Olympia and Delphi, the Greeks found ways to gather peacefully, even in times of conflict. Olympia, known for its sacred games in honor of Zeus, became a place where athletes from different city-states competed not for conquest, but for glory and grace. At Delphi, beneath the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the oracle of Apollo offered cryptic wisdom to those who sought it, her voice floating from the temple like the mist from nearby springs. These places became centers of unity in a fragmented world, reflecting the dual nature of Greek civilization, fiercely independent, yet bound by invisible threads of shared belief and tradition. As the Archaic period unfolded, art and architecture flourished. Pottery painted in black and red told stories of gods and heroes, of battles and banquets. Sculptors learned to carve the human form with ever more natural grace, moving from the stiff symmetry of earlier works to lifelike expressions of poise and motion. In language, the Greeks revived writing with a new alphabet, one that, unlike the scripts of earlier ages, would eventually give rise to Western writing systems, including our own. Through this alphabet, the epic tales of Homer, passed down for generations, were finally set to page. The Iliad and the Odyssey, with their themes of honor, struggle, and homecoming, would go on to shape the imagination of the Western world for millennia. And yet, for all its growth and outward expansion, Greek civilization remained deeply tied to the land, to the gentle curve of an olive tree's branches, to the stone-paved streets of hillside towns, to the rhythms of planting and harvest, festival and worship. Life in the city-states was both practical and poetic, filled with duties and dreams, shaped by terrain and tradition. In these early foundations we see the outlines of something enduring, something uniquely Greek, a civilization that would soon enter a golden age of astonishing achievement. As this golden age dawns, we find ourselves at the threshold of one of history's most luminous chapters, a period of philosophy, drama, democracy, and art, all unfolding under the bright skies of classical Greece. And so, in the gentle glow of that rising light, we move forward toward the city of Athens and the world it would create. Amid the hills and plains of Attica, where the wind carried the scent of wild thyme and the bleating of goats echoed through olive groves, there emerged a city unlike any other, not the largest in territory, nor the most dominant in military power, not at first, at least, but one whose spirit seemed to stretch far beyond its physical boundaries. Athens, perched between mountains and sea, would become the beating heart of classical Greece, its influence radiating outward in ideas, in architecture, in art, and in the quietly revolutionary experiment known as democracy. The early city of Athens was shaped, like so many others, by necessity. Surrounded by stony terrain, with only pockets of fertile land, the people of Athens turned to trade and craftsmanship. Their harbor at Piraeus bustled with ships from across the Aegean, bringing goods and stories from distant places. This connection to the wider world brought both prosperity and perspective. Over time, a society emerged that placed great value on debate, on civic duty, and on the exchange of ideas. It was not always peaceful. Internal strife and inequality threatened the city's cohesion more than once, but out of struggle often grows transformation. One of the most significant changes in Athenian history came with the reforms of Solon, a statesman and poet who lived in the early 6th century BCE. Faced with a society burdened by debt and division, Solon introduced a set of laws aimed at balancing justice with order. He cancelled crushing debts, restructured the political system to give more citizens a voice, and encouraged economic innovation. Though his reforms did not create full democracy, they laid the groundwork for what would come. The idea that political participation should extend beyond a small elite took root here, in soil both literal and metaphorical, and it would continue to grow. Decades later, that growth would be nurtured by Cleisthenes, often remembered as the father of Athenian democracy. His reorganization of the political system based on geographic districts rather than familial ties helped to break the grip of aristocratic power. Through a council of 500 citizens and the use of sortition, selecting officials by lot, Athens began a bold and imperfect journey towards self-rule. This was not democracy as we know it today. Only free male citizens could participate, leaving women, slaves, and foreigners excluded from the process. Yet in the context of its time, it was a radical and influential departure from the norm, one that placed trust in the collective judgment of ordinary people. While politics took root in the assembly and the agora, culture blossomed across every surface of Athenian life. It was during this period that drama found its form, not merely as entertainment, but as a civic and sacred tradition. In open-air theatres built into the natural contours of hillsides, audiences gathered to witness the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, playwrights whose works explored fate, justice, and the frailties of the human heart. Comedy, too, found a home in Athens, with Aristophanes crafting sharp, satirical plays that poked fun at politics, philosophy, and even the gods themselves. These performances were more than diversions. They were acts of collective reflection, woven into religious festivals and the rhythms of the city's soul. Just as the stage invited contemplation, so too did the city's streets and schools. Nowhere was this more evident than in the life of Socrates, a stonemason turned philosopher who spent his days walking barefoot through the city, engaging in quiet, persistent questioning. Socrates left behind no writings of his own, but through the dialogues recorded by his student Plato, his method, asking, probing, examining, became a cornerstone of Western thought. He challenged assumptions, encouraged self-awareness, and held that the unexamined life was not worth living. In a time and place where certainty was often prized, Socrates embraced doubt as a path to wisdom. Art and architecture flourished alongside philosophy. The Parthenon, dedicated to the goddess Athena, rose atop the Acropolis as a symbol of civic pride and religious devotion. Built in the mid-5th century BCE, under the leadership of Pericles, the temple's harmonious proportions and refined details reflected the ideals of balance and beauty, so central to Greek thought. Its sculptural friezes told stories not just of gods and heroes, but of the people of Athens themselves, dignified, purposeful, and part of something greater. The city became a canvas for creativity, from painted pottery and intricate jewelry to vast public buildings and quiet courtyards lined with columns. Daily life in Athens was at once bustling and contemplative. The agora served as a marketplace, a meeting place, and a forum for discussion. Citizens came here to trade, to listen, to argue, and to think. Children, especially boys, received an education in reading, music, gymnastics, and rhetoric, a training meant to shape both mind and body. Though women's roles were more restricted in public life, within the home they oversaw households, wove intricate textiles, and maintained the religious traditions that formed the foundation of family life. Slavery was widespread and often hidden beneath the surface of everyday affairs, a quiet presence that enabled much of the visible prosperity. Amid all this vibrancy, the city also faced its shadows. Conflict with rival city-states, particularly Sparta, loomed on the horizon. Questions of power, justice, and the limits of freedom grew more pressing with time. And yet, for a brief span, during the height of the classical period, Athens stood as a beacon of human possibility, a place where the pursuit of truth and beauty was woven into the very fabric of civic life. As we drift onward in this gentle story, the scene begins to broaden. We leave the bustling streets of Athens behind for a while and look outward once more to the wider Greek world and the forces that would both connect and divide it. In the next section, we turn our attention to the Persian Wars and how a shared struggle helped shape a sense of collective Greek identity, even among fiercely independent city-states. Across the shimmering waters of the Aegean Sea, far to the east, lay the heart of the Persian Empire, a vast and glittering realm that stretched from the plains of Anatolia to the valleys of India. It was a land of rivers and palaces, ruled by kings who styled themselves lords of the earth, guardians of order, across a world knit together by roads and tribute. By the early 5th century BCE, this empire had reached the doorstep of the Greek world, and so began a series of encounters that, though marked by conflict, would also foster an unexpected kind of solidarity among the Greeks. The story often begins with the Ionian Revolt, a relatively small uprising by Greek colonies on the western coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. These cities, culturally Greek but under Persian rule, grew restless. Their rebellion drew support from Athens and Eretria, a gesture that, while modest in scale, reached the ears of the Persian king, Darius I. For the great king, it was not merely an act of defiance, but a breach of the harmony he believed the world should uphold. And so a campaign westward began, not only to punish but to absorb. The first Persian invasion came in 490 BCE, carried on ships across the sea. When the Persians landed at Marathon, a broad plain near Athens, they were met by a smaller force of Athenian hoplites, citizen soldiers clad in bronze, arranged in tight ranks. It was here that legend and history blend most gently. The Athenians, against expectation, held their ground and won a startling victory. The image of the lone runner, said to have raced from Marathon to Athens to deliver news of the triumph before collapsing from exhaustion, still lingers in the cultural memory. Whether literal or symbolic, his story captures the urgency and devotion of a people defending their home. But peace was fleeting. A decade later, a second, far greater invasion was launched under Darius's successor, Xerxes I. This time the scale was vast. A bridge of boats was laid across the Hellespont, and armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands crossed into Europe. As the storm approached, the Greeks faced a difficult truth. Their survival would depend on cooperation. City-states that had often viewed each other with suspicion, Athens, Sparta, Corinth and others, began to form alliances. Though unity was incomplete and fragile, it was a beginning. The defense of Greece unfolded in a series of episodes now etched into the soft stone of collective legend. At Thermopylae, a narrow pass between mountain and sea, a small force of Greeks, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, held back the advancing Persian army for several days. Though eventually overcome, their stand became a quiet symbol of resolve and sacrifice, not as grand gestures of heroism, but as reminders of what people will endure when defending something cherished. Further south, the naval battle at Salamis turned the tide. Athenian ships, guided by strategy and intimate knowledge of the local waters, outmaneuvered the Persian fleet in narrow straits. The power of the sea once again proved central to Greek destiny. By 479 BCE, the final major engagements at Plataea and Mycale brought the wars to an end. Persia would not return in force, and the Greek mainland remained unconquered. In the aftermath, the question arose, what now? The memory of shared resistance lingered, and for a brief time, the idea of a pan-Hellenic identity, an identity rooted in language, religion, and customs rather than in borders or rulers, seemed almost within reach. Yet even in the wake of unity, older rivalries returned. Athens, having played a decisive role in the wars, now found itself at the center of a growing sphere of influence. The Delian League, originally formed as a defensive alliance, began to resemble something more like an empire, with Athens at its head and tribute flowing in from allied, and sometimes unwilling, members. This transformation was gradual, not sudden, but it marked a shift in the balance of power, and in the character of Greek politics. At the same time, the cultural aftershocks of the Persian Wars were subtle and profound. The sense of contrast between East and West, between autocracy and freedom, became a recurring theme in Greek thought, though never simple, never black and white. Many Greeks admired elements of Persian organization, wealth, and sophistication, even as they held tightly to their own ideals of civic participation and local independence. Out of this tension came some of the most enduring reflections in Greek literature and art, from the tragic plays of Aeschylus to the visual depictions of Persian and Greek warriors locked in balance, not caricatured, but human, proud, and mortal. It is easy to look back on such events and see only the battles, only the clashes of arms and names of generals. But beneath those movements were currents of culture and identity, memory and meaning that flowed through ordinary lives. A farmer in Boeotia, a priestess in Delphi, a potter in Corinth, each would have heard of the wars, spoken of them in hushed tones or over shared bread, seen their effects in trade and festival and shifting alliances. History, after all, is not only the record of what happened, but the gentle accumulation of how people remembered, responded, and reimagined what it meant. As the 5th century progressed, Athens entered its most radiant phase, a time of expansion, expression, and eventual strain. In our next chapter, we return once more to that shimmering city, now at the height of its influence, to trace the contours of its empire, its contradictions, and the long, slow turning of its golden age toward shadow. By the middle of the 5th century BCE, Athens stood as a city transformed. The scars of war had faded into the foundations of new buildings. From the bustling port of Piraeus to the heights of the Acropolis, signs of prosperity could be seen in gleaming marble, in sunlit colonnades, and in the voices of poets and architects crafting visions of permanence. It was a time of golden confidence, when Athens no longer saw itself merely as a city among many, but as the cultural and political heart of the Greek world. At the center of this flourishing stood Pericles, a statesman, orator, and patron of the arts, who helped guide Athens through its most radiant decades. His leadership was marked not by conquest in the traditional sense, but by the expansion of Athenian influence through diplomacy, tribute, and the persuasive pull of cultural brilliance. Under his direction, Athens oversaw the rebuilding of the Acropolis, turning it into a symbol of divine favor and human possibility. The Parthenon, completed during his time, became the crown jewel of this effort, a temple not only to the goddess Athena, but to the spirit of the city itself. Within its sanctuary, massive columns rose toward the open sky, framing sculptural scenes of myth and ritual. The inner chamber held a towering statue of Athena, clothed in gold and ivory, holding wisdom in one hand and victory in the other. It was a work of both devotion and declaration, a quiet assertion of Athens' place at the center of the Greek world. Around the city, temples, stoas, and public spaces reflected similar ideals: order, harmony, and beauty measured not only in form but in proportion, in the subtle balance between parts and whole. Culture in Athens did not reside only in stone. It lived in conversation and in competition. The city's festivals grew larger and more elaborate, especially the Panathenaea, which celebrated Athena with music, poetry, athletic games, and a grand procession through the streets. The theater remained a sacred space where new tragedies and comedies continued to explore the human condition, not as isolated performance, but as collective ritual. Audiences gathered by the thousands, not merely to be entertained, but to listen, reflect, and remember. The stories told on stage, of Oedipus, of Medea, of Prometheus, were mirrors in which the audience glimpsed their own fears, virtues, and frailties. In the shaded groves and gymnasia, philosophy deepened. Plato, who would later found his academy, absorbed the lessons of Socrates and began to imagine worlds of ideal forms and eternal truths. Questions of justice, beauty, and the good life were not confined to ivory towers. They unfolded amid the everyday, in the agora, in the classroom, in the quiet moments between tasks. Athens had become a place where ideas flourished alongside trade, and where the mind was as celebrated as the sword. Yet beneath this flourishing surface, there stirred the slow, steady undercurrents of tension. Athens, once the leader of a voluntary alliance against Persia, now presided over what many considered an empire in all but name. The Delian League, initially headquartered on the sacred island of Delos, had seen its treasury quietly move to Athens. Tribute from allied cities funded the city's monuments, its ships, its festivals, enriching Athens while breeding resentment among those who paid the cost. What had begun as unity in defense became, over time, an imbalance of power cloaked in shared heritage. Some allies tried to leave the League and were swiftly brought back into line, sometimes by force. Athens justified its actions as necessary for stability, but for others, it began to feel less like leadership and more like domination. These quiet fractures widened with time, as Athens' pride in its cultural role mingled with the burdens of maintaining control. The line between guardian and ruler blurred, and the city's famed democracy began to show the subtle strains of managing an empire from within. At home, democracy continued to evolve. Citizens gathered in the assembly to vote on laws, elect generals, and decide matters of war and peace. But participation had its limits, reserved for free males born to Athenian parents. Metics, or resident foreigners, could live and work in the city, but held no political rights. Enslaved people, who performed much of the labor that sustained Athens' comforts, remained largely invisible in civic life. Women, too, were confined to the private sphere, their influence vital, but often unrecorded. These exclusions, while common for the time, stood in quiet contrast to the city's ideals of equality and reason. Still, the dream of Athens endured. Its schools and statues, its dramas and debates, all spoke of a belief in human potential, in the possibility that through reason, beauty, and shared governance, people could create a society both noble and lasting. This dream would echo far beyond its time, leaving footprints in the minds of thinkers and founders for centuries to come. But history, like the sea, shifts with tides both visible and unseen. As Athens grew stronger, Sparta watched with wary eyes. The city of warriors, austere and disciplined, had long held a different vision of order, one rooted in stability, restraint, and collective strength. As tensions deepened between the two great powers, the Greek world edged quietly toward division. In the next section, we turn gently toward this growing rivalry, not in shouts or clash of arms, but in the quieter rhythms of mistrust, fear, and the choices that led a brilliant civilization toward a long and weary conflict, the Peloponnesian War. There are moments in history when paths begin to part, not with thunder or sudden fracture, but with the slow, steady drift of difference. So it was with Athens and Sparta, two cities that stood at the heart of the Greek world, bound by shared language, gods, and memories of past alliances, yet increasingly shaped by ways of life that could not help but diverge. As the 5th century unfolded, their relationship evolved not in bursts of anger, but in quiet hesitations and mirrored suspicions, as if two old friends had begun to realize they no longer saw the world quite the same way. Sparta, far to the south in the region of Laconia, lived in stark contrast to the bustling openness of Athens. Nestled between rugged mountains and inland valleys, it was a land where simplicity was not only preferred, but carefully cultivated. Spartan society was built around discipline, order, and a deep commitment to the collective. From a young age, boys were taken from their families to be trained in endurance and obedience. Military service was not just a duty, it was the center of life, a defining bond between citizen and state. Wealth and luxury were discouraged. Gold and silver coins were shunned. Music, poetry, and speech had their place, but were always measured, always restrained. The Spartans prided themselves on stability, a stability achieved through a rigid social hierarchy and the silent labor of others. The Helots, an enslaved population primarily drawn from neighboring lands, worked the fields and produced the goods that allowed the Spartan elite to focus wholly on training and governance. Fear of Helot rebellion kept the Spartans wary and conservative, hesitant to extend themselves beyond their borders for fear of internal collapse. Isolation was both policy and instinct. Sparta held tightly to its traditions, believing that in constancy lay survival. Athens, by contrast, was dynamic, fluid, ever in motion. The city buzzed with trade and debate, innovation and ambition. Its empire had grown not just by strength, but through the cultural magnetism of its festivals, its architecture, and its promise of shared identity under Athenian guidance. While Sparta turned inward to protect itself, Athens looked outward to shape the world. This fundamental difference, one of temperament as much as policy, formed the quiet bedrock of growing unease. Tensions began to rise in the years following the Persian Wars, as Athens solidified its control over the Delian League. While Athens saw itself as a leader protecting Greek interests, many of its allies began to feel more like subjects. Tribute payments increased, local autonomy shrank, and military support was expected. When cities tried to withdraw, they were often met with swift reprisal. Sparta watched these developments with increasing discomfort, concerned that Athenian power was expanding beyond mere influence into something more imperial. The balance that had once united the Greeks against a common enemy now tilted, and Sparta felt the tilt most keenly. A series of smaller conflicts and diplomatic disputes marked the decades before the war. Corinth, an ally of Sparta, grew irritated with Athens' interference in Western Greek affairs. Megara, a city near Athens, found itself economically isolated by Athenian trade sanctions. Skirmishes flared across the Aegean. Each grievance alone may have seemed manageable, but together they formed a tapestry of slow-building strain. Mutual suspicion grew, each side accusing the other of overreach, of bad faith, of preparing for conflict. In 431 BCE, these tensions finally broke into open war. But the path to that point was not carved in haste. It was walked slowly, over years, by people who believed themselves rational, cautious, and defensive. It is a quiet reminder that great conflicts often begin, not with bold declarations, but with careful steps down a narrowing road, until the way back becomes less visible than the way forward. The Peloponnesian War, as it came to be called, was not a single campaign, but a long and wearying struggle that stretched over nearly 3 decades. It touched nearly every part of the Greek world, reshaping alliances, economies, and lives. Yet even amid conflict, life continued. Fields were sown, children were born, plays were performed, temples were built. War, like weather, passed through the rhythms of life, sometimes violently, sometimes in long, quiet seasons of waiting. In the next section, we will follow the course of this war gently, not through strategy and tactics, but through its effects on the people, the culture, and the cities that endured it. We will walk slowly through the rise and fall of expectations, the moments of hope, the intervals of loss, and the deep questions of purpose that lingered in the silence between battles. There is a kind of weariness that seeps in, not with a single blow but through long repetition, a tiredness of spirit as much as of body. So it was with the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that unfolded not as a thunderclap, but as a long and grinding storm. For nearly 30 years, Athens and Sparta, along with their many allies and subject states, moved through cycles of siege and stalemate, of hope and collapse, of uneasy truces and renewed hostilities. The war did not consume every moment of those years. There were pauses, treaties, festivals and harvests, but it cast its shadow over them all, a quiet backdrop of tension that never quite lifted. At the war's outset, Athens held the advantage of the sea. Its navy was unmatched, swift and disciplined, capable of reaching distant shores with ease. Sparta, meanwhile, commanded the land, its hoplite forces feared for their discipline and strength in close formation. The early years were shaped by this contrast. Sparta invaded the Athenian countryside, burning fields and villages, while Athens withdrew behind its great long walls, stretching from the city to its port at Piraeus. The city relied on its ships to bring grain from afar, trusting that time and resources would favor its position. But the sea could not shield the Athenians from everything. In the second year of the war, a plague swept through the crowded city, carried in by ships, and spread quickly in the tight confines of the walls. The sickness claimed thousands, including the statesman Pericles, the very voice of Athens during its golden age. His loss was not just political. It marked a turning point in mood, a soft shift in tone, as Athens began to feel the first tremors of uncertainty. The plague revealed the fragility beneath the confidence, the thin veil that separates order from chaos. Even as the war dragged on, the city tried to maintain its rhythms. Plays were still performed. Philosophers still walked the agora. Children still played in the courtyards and alleys. But the tension wore on people in ways less visible than battles. Families were divided, fortunes were lost, fields went untended. The ideals that had once seemed so central to Athenian life, reason, balance, participation, began to strain beneath the pressure of prolonged conflict. One of the more ambitious turns in the war came with the Athenian expedition to Sicily, launched in 415 BCE. It was a bold and distant campaign, intended to expand influence and secure new resources. Yet from the beginning, the venture was fraught with poor planning and internal disagreements. The fleet set sail with grandeur, but far from home, things unraveled. In 413 BCE, after months of missteps and resistance, the entire force was destroyed, ships lost, soldiers captured or killed, and Athenian morale shattered. It was not just a military defeat, it was a wound to the Athenian spirit, a soft unraveling of the belief that reason and resolve could shape destiny. At home, trust began to erode, political factions hardened, democratic institutions, once a source of pride, became battlegrounds for blame and ambition. Briefly, Athens even abandoned its democracy in favor of oligarchic rule, only to return to democratic governance after more internal struggle. These shifts were not just about power, but about identity. What kind of city was Athens if it could no longer live up to its own ideals? Meanwhile, Sparta had changed too. Once cautious and restrained, it now accepted aid from Persia, the very empire it had once helped to repel. With Persian gold, Sparta built a fleet and challenged Athenian dominance at sea. The balance of the war shifted again, quietly but decisively. In 404 BCE, after years of dwindling resources and mounting losses, Athens surrendered. Its walls were torn down, its fleet reduced, its empire dissolved. Yet the story did not end in ruin. Athens was not destroyed. Its people remained. Its temples still stood. Over time, the city would recover some of its strength, though never quite as it had before. The war had left more than physical damage. It had carved into the soul of the city, leaving questions that echoed in its streets long after peace returned. What had been gained? What had been lost? Was greatness a matter of power or of character? These were the reflections left in the silence that followed. Through it all, the voices of its thinkers and artists continued. Even in defeat, Athens remained a place of learning, of memory, of persistent thought. Socrates, now old, continued to ask his questions, drawing people into gentle dialogues about virtue and truth. His presence reminded the city, and us, that even amid uncertainty, the search for understanding can endure. In the next section, we remain with the philosophers and the quieter pursuits of wisdom that flourished in the wake of war. As the world around Athens shifted, its thinkers turned inward, seeking meaning in a changing world and leaving behind ideas that would echo gently through the centuries. When war first settles over a land, it rarely announces itself in thunder. More often, it arrives like a slow turning of the weather. First, a cool shift in the air, then the thickening of clouds on a once familiar horizon. So it was with the Peloponnesian War, which began not in fire or conquest, but in cautious suspicion, in quiet positioning, in words that grew sharper as seasons passed. And once it began, it did not end quickly. For nearly 30 years, Athens and Sparta, the two greatest powers of the Greek world, wove themselves into a conflict that stretched across a generation, changing the very rhythm of life in the process. In the early stages, the Athenians held fast to their belief in the strength of the sea. Their empire was built upon the movement of ships, the control of islands and coastal cities, and the flow of tribute from across the Aegean. Their navy, swift and disciplined, allowed them to strike far from home and supply themselves even under siege. Sparta, by contrast, was a land power known for its hoplites, well-trained citizen soldiers whose phalanx formations had won them respect and fear throughout Greece. These differences shaped the first years of the war. The Spartans invaded the farmlands of Attica by land, while the Athenians took shelter behind their mighty long walls, relying on their fleet to keep them fed and connected to the outside world. But no wall could keep out illness. In 430 BCE, only a year after the war had begun, a terrible plague struck Athens. Carried by ship and spread quickly in the cramped quarters behind the city's walls, the disease moved with silent speed, sparing few. Entire families perished. Temples overflowed with desperate prayers. In the end, the plague may have claimed up to a third of the city's population. Among its victims was Pericles, the man who had led Athens through its golden age and who had encouraged the very strategy that brought people inside the city's protective walls. His death marked more than the loss of a leader. It signaled the end of a certain kind of vision, a belief that the city's greatness would carry it through even the darkest storms. Yet Athens endured. After the worst of the plague passed, it reasserted its strength and resumed the war. Periods of fighting were broken by moments of uneasy peace. There were victories and setbacks on both sides, but no resolution. The fighting spread across the Greek world, in the seas around Sicily, in the northern reaches of the Aegean, even into Asia Minor. Alliances shifted like tides. New leaders emerged, but always the war returned, wearing down the people like water on stone. One of the most fateful moments came with the Athenian expedition to Sicily in 415 BCE. Emboldened by ambition and driven by the belief that expansion could bring new wealth and security, Athens sent a massive fleet and army to the distant island, hoping to conquer the powerful city of Syracuse. At first, the campaign was confident and well supplied. But far from home, amid unfamiliar terrain and growing resistance, things began to unravel. Commanders disagreed. Supplies grew thin. Reinforcements arrived too late. In 413 BCE, the Athenian force was trapped, defeated, and destroyed. The fleet was lost. Thousands were killed or captured. It was not just a military failure, it was a wound to the very idea of Athenian invincibility. Back home, the news arrived like a chill wind. For a city that had once seen itself as a beacon of light, the loss in Sicily was devastating. Morale fell, factions deepened. Political confidence began to falter. In a time of uncertainty, Athens briefly abandoned its democracy, turning to oligarchic rule in a desperate attempt to regain control. This experiment with restricted governance lasted only a short while, and democracy was restored soon after, but the moment revealed just how fragile the city's institutions had become under the weight of war. Meanwhile, Sparta found new strength. Long hesitant to engage fully in naval warfare, it now accepted aid from an old enemy, Persia. With Persian funding, Sparta built a fleet of its own and challenged Athenian dominance at sea. This shift altered the course of the war. Battles that once favored Athens now became costly and uncertain. Islands once secure turned vulnerable. Tribute from the empire dwindled. Trust in the old strategies faded. In 404 BCE, after a prolonged siege and the final collapse of its naval power, Athens surrendered. The long walls were dismantled. The city's empire was no more. And yet, even in defeat, Athens was not destroyed. This ending, like much of the war itself, came not with spectacle, but with exhaustion. There was no mass burning of temples, no razing of monuments. The Acropolis still stood. The marketplaces still echoed with footsteps. The sea still rolled gently against the shores of Piraeus. But something had changed. The golden confidence of a generation before had dimmed into something more introspective, more cautious. The war had carved not just into stone and soil, but into memory and thought. What remained, however, was the city's mind. Even in its weakened state, Athens remained a center of learning and reflection. Philosophers, playwrights, and teachers continued their work, questioning what had gone wrong, what had endured, and what still mattered. Socrates, now an old man, continued to wander the streets, barefoot and calm, inviting others to consider justice, truth, and the nature of the good life. His questions, once admired, now stirred discomfort in a city that had grown tired of uncertainty. In 399 BCE, he was brought to trial and sentenced to death, not for war, not for treason, but for impiety and the supposed corruption of youth. It was a quiet tragedy, reflecting the anxious search for order in a world that had become harder to understand. Yet Socrates' legacy did not end with him. His student Plato began to write, preserving the dialogues and building his own school of philosophy. From these seeds, ideas would grow that would influence minds for millennia. In defeat, Athens still offered wisdom. In uncertainty, it still nurtured thought. As we move onward, the story of Greece begins to shift again. In the space left by Athens' decline, new voices rise, from Sparta's brief supremacy to the rise of Thebes, and ultimately to the birth of a young Macedonian prince whose ambition would carry the spirit of Greece far beyond its borders. But before we meet him, we linger a little longer in this moment of reflection, where philosophy, not power, quietly shapes the next chapter of a changing world. When the sounds of war finally faded, what remained in Athens was not silence, but thought. The streets that had once echoed with the tramp of citizens marching to the assembly now carried softer rhythms, the murmur of debate under shaded colonnades, the steady footsteps of students gathering in the early light, the low voice of a teacher asking not how to win, but how to live. Though the Peloponnesian War had humbled the city and stripped away its empire, it had not erased its soul. In place of ships and tribute came questions, the kind that linger even after battles end. The decades that followed the war were ones of recovery, not just of buildings and institutions, but of meaning. For those who had grown up in the Golden Age, who had seen the city's confidence rise and then watched it crumble, the desire to understand ran deep. Why had Athens, with its art, its democracy, its learning, fallen so far? Was the decline the result of poor decisions, or of something woven more deeply into human nature itself? These were not questions with simple answers, and so they were asked again and again, in different forms, in different places, by different minds. Chief among these minds was Plato. Born into an aristocratic family not long before the war began, Plato came of age during the years of turmoil and rebuilding. As a young man, he had studied under Socrates, absorbing the older philosopher's calm method of questioning, his belief that knowledge could be found not by force or decree, but through conversation and careful thought. Socrates had taught in the open air, speaking with anyone willing to listen, merchants, soldiers, slaves, politicians. He left no writings, preferring the living moment of dialogue. But Plato, after Socrates' execution, set about preserving his teacher's voice in written form. In his dialogues, Plato gave Socrates a second life, allowing him to explore themes of justice, love, truth, and governance with a clarity that blended memory and imagination. These writings were not just philosophy, they were acts of healing, of restoration. Through them, Plato sought to rebuild not walls or fleets, but the foundations of human thought. In the Republic, perhaps his most famous work, he imagined a city governed not by wealth or popularity, but by wisdom, a place where the soul of the ruler mirrored the order of the state. He was not writing a manual for power, but dreaming aloud, asking his readers to consider not what was, but what could be. To pursue these ideas more fully, Plato founded a school on the outskirts of Athens, in a grove once sacred to the hero Academus. There, in what became known as the Academy, students gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, ethics, and logic. There was no rigid curriculum, no prescribed dogma, only a commitment to inquiry, and the shared hope that by understanding the world, one might better live within it. The academy would endure for centuries, its spirit passed from teacher to student, like a quiet lamp carried through time. Among those students was a young man from the north of Greece, sent to Athens by his father at the age of 17. His name was Aristotle. Where Plato sought eternal forms, Aristotle turned his gaze to the world itself, to the shapes of leaves, the movement of animals, the patterns of thought and speech. He believed that knowledge began in observation, in noticing what others passed by. Over the years, he would write on subjects as varied as biology, politics, poetry, and physics. His treatises were careful, systematic, and grounded in the belief that understanding required both curiosity and patience. Aristotle remained at the academy for 2 decades, eventually developing his own distinct views. He taught not only in lecture but in walking, his followers sometimes called the peripatetics, or those who walk around. The rhythm of movement matched the rhythm of thought, slow, deliberate, open. When he eventually left Athens, Aristotle carried its intellectual spirit with him into new cities, new students, and new stages of influence. What made this period so remarkable was not merely the brilliance of a few individuals, but the atmosphere that allowed such thought to flourish. Despite its political decline, Athens remained a place where ideas could be exchanged freely, where memory and imagination coexisted in fragile balance. The agora still hosted debates. The gymnasia still echoed with recitations. Libraries began to collect scrolls, preserving the writings not only of Greeks, but of Egyptians, Babylonians, and others who had asked similar questions in distant lands. It was also a time when the boundaries between philosophy and life blurred. Ethics was not a distant discipline, it was a way of being. The schools that emerged during this period were not just centers of learning, but guides for how to live. The Cynics, for example, led lives of radical simplicity, rejecting wealth and social status in favor of virtue and self-sufficiency. The Stoics, whose roots were planted later in this fertile soil, taught that inner peace came from accepting the world's order and cultivating one's own reason. These schools would shape the moral frameworks of later generations, quietly influencing Roman emperors, medieval theologians, and modern thinkers alike. And so, in the quiet years after the war, when the temples still stood and the empire had passed, Athens became something new, not an empire of land or coin, but a sanctuary of thought. A place where the questions of life, once spoken in the shade of a fig tree or beneath a painted portico, continued to drift on the wind. These questions, what is justice? What is happiness? What is the nature of the soul? Would outlast marble and monument. They would travel far into the minds of those yet unborn. As the sun begins to lower on classical Athens, a new light begins to rise from the northern horizon. In the land of Macedon, a boy is growing, one taught by Aristotle himself, one whose vision will stretch far beyond the borders of Greece. In the next section, we follow the rise of Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, and how the world of the polis began to give way to something larger, something more global, yet still deeply shaped by the ideas first spoken beneath the Athenian sky. North of the bustling cities of southern Greece, beyond the plains of Thessaly and the shadows of Mount Olympus, lay the kingdom of Macedon, a land of broad valleys, forested hills, and hardy, practical people. For much of the classical period, Macedon had remained on the periphery of Greek affairs, seen by many city-states as a kind of distant cousin, sharing language and religion, but not quite part of the inner circle of the Hellenic world. Its people were viewed as rustic, its politics unstable, and its culture less refined than that of Athens or Corinth. But in the quiet of these assumptions, Macedon gathered strength. The man who would bring that strength to bear was Philip II, a skilled strategist and charismatic leader who took the throne in 359 BCE after years of internal division and external threats. Philip understood that survival in a world dominated by city-states required more than tradition, it required innovation. He reformed the Macedonian army, equipping it with longer spears called sarissas, and training his soldiers to fight in deep, disciplined formations. He reorganized his kingdom's finances, secured valuable alliances through diplomacy and marriage, and slowly extended Macedonian influence across the north. But Philip's genius was not only military, he also saw the power of ideas, the soft strength of culture, and sought to bring his kingdom into closer connection with the legacy of southern Greece. To that end, he invited intellectuals to his court, supported the arts, and placed a high value on education. When his own son Alexander reached the right age, Philip sought out the best tutor he could find. And so it was that Aristotle, the philosopher who had walked and taught in the shaded groves of Athens, came north to Macedon to teach the young prince. For several years, Alexander studied under Aristotle in a place called Mysa, a quiet town nestled among trees and streams. There, in a sheltered sanctuary surrounded by nature, the boy who would one day lead armies across continents was first led through the pages of Homer, through the principles of logic, through the patterns of the natural world. Aristotle taught him not only how to think, but how to see, to look beyond the moment, beyond pride or impulse, and to consider the deeper causes of human behavior and the subtle structure of the world. Alexander absorbed these lessons with energy and fascination. He read the Iliad as if it were a guidebook, keeping a copy close to him even in later campaigns. He was taught to appreciate Greek drama, ethics, science, and rhetoric, all the fruits of the cultural flowering that had begun generations earlier in Athens. These ideas would shape not just his mind, but his sense of purpose. When he eventually stepped onto the world stage, it would be not simply as a conqueror, but as a man carrying a vision of cultural connection and intellectual ambition. Meanwhile, Philip's ambitions in Greece continued to grow. Through a combination of military success, clever diplomacy, and strategic pressure, he extended Macedonian influence deep into the Greek peninsula. The turning point came in 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip's forces defeated a coalition of Greek city-states led by Athens and Thebes. It was a hard-won victory, and a symbolic one. Greece, long divided and fiercely independent, now stood under the influence of a single northern power. Yet Philip did not seek to destroy the city-states. Instead, he formed a new alliance known as the League of Corinth, presenting himself not as a tyrant, but as a unifier. His stated aim was to lead a united Greek campaign against Persia, an echo of old rivalries but now with far greater scale. That campaign, however, would not be his to lead. In 336 BCE, just as his plans were coming to fruition, Philip was assassinated under circumstances still debated today. His death sent a tremor through the court, but the transition of power was swift. Alexander, barely 20 years old, was declared king. The young ruler inherited more than a throne. He stepped into a moment heavy with possibility, a trained army, a vast treasury, and a vision left half-formed. What followed was one of the most extraordinary journeys in human history. Over the next decade, Alexander would cross deserts and mountains, rivers and plains, reaching lands no Greek had seen, and forging a path that blended the force of arms with the reach of culture. But before we follow that path, we linger for a moment in Macedon, where a young man stood at the edge of the known world, holding in one hand the sword of his father, and in the other the lessons of his teacher. He had been raised on Homer and Herodotus, on logic and myth, and now he would step into legend himself. In the next section, we follow Alexander on his march east, through Anatolia into Egypt, across the plains of Mesopotamia, not only as a general, but as a bearer of the Greek legacy, shaping the ancient world in ways both vast and unexpectedly tender. It began quietly enough, with the soft creak of wooden wheels turning on dusted roads, the rhythmic steps of soldiers moving eastward, and the breath of horses rising like mist in the morning chill. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the narrow waters of the Hellespont, the same stretch of sea where myth had once placed the flight of lovers and the wrath of gods, and set foot in Asia Minor. The step was not merely military, it was symbolic. Greece, long bound within the limits of its own peninsula and scattered islands, now began to extend its spirit into the broader world. Though he marched as a king and general, Alexander also carried within him the inheritance of Plato and Aristotle, of Homer and Herodotus, of Athens and its quieter companions. He had been raised to see the world not just as territory to be taken, but as a canvas upon which to paint new ideas. His first act upon arriving in Asia was to visit the ancient site of Troy. There, Amid the ruins of walls and tombs, he honored the memory of Achilles, the hero whose story had shaped his boyhood dreams. It was an act of reverence, not conquest, a quiet reminder that in the world of Alexander, past and present walked together. The early campaigns were swift and decisive. At the Battle of the Granicus River, Alexander's forces defeated a Persian satrapal army, opening the path through western Anatolia. City after city submitted or was absorbed. But Alexander was not merely conquering, he was also founding. Along his route he established new settlements, many of them named Alexandria, not as isolated garrisons, but as seeds of Greek culture in foreign soil. In these cities, Greek language, art and governance mingled with local customs, creating something neither wholly Greek nor wholly native, but something new, Hellenism, the gentle blending of East and West. As the campaign continued, Alexander moved steadily through Phrygia, Cilicia, and into Syria. In 333 BCE, he met the Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Issus. The Persian army was vast, its banners stretching across the horizon like a sea of color. But Alexander's tactics, sharpened by experience and instinct, prevailed. Darius fled, leaving behind his family, whom Alexander treated not as prisoners, but with respect and dignity. It was an act noted even by his enemies, a quiet signal that this was not a campaign of revenge, but of reshaping. From Syria, Alexander moved south into Egypt, where he was received not as a conqueror but as a liberator. The Egyptians, long under Persian control, saw in Alexander a new kind of ruler, one who honored their gods and walked their sacred paths. In 331 BCE, he founded the city of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile, designing it as a meeting point between worlds. The city would grow to become one of the most significant centers of knowledge in the ancient world, its library later housing the wisdom of many lands and many tongues. In Egypt, Alexander also visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa, deep in the desert. There, in solitude and sand, he sought affirmation of his divine role, not in arrogance, but in alignment with the ancient traditions of kingship that spanned cultures and continents. After leaving Egypt, Alexander turned once more to the heart of Persia. In 331 BCE, near the village of Gaugamela, he faced Darius again. The Persian forces were vast, but the outcome followed the same pattern. Strategy overcame size, and the once great empire began to unravel. Babylon fell, then Susa, then Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, adorned with palaces, terraces, and carved reliefs that had told the story of an empire for centuries. Alexander entered Persepolis with reverence. For months he stayed there, absorbing its culture and holding court among its scholars. But even amid respect, old tensions stirred. In a night of wine and uncertainty, the palace of Persepolis was set aflame. Whether by plan or impulse remains uncertain. But the moment marked a turning point, the quiet burning away of one world as another emerged. Throughout his journey, Alexander continued to adopt local customs and integrate them into his rule. He wore Persian robes, appointed native officials, and encouraged intermarriage between his soldiers and local women. Some of his Macedonian followers bristled at these choices, seeing in them a dilution of their identity. But for Alexander, they were part of a broader vision, a world not divided, but woven together. His was not a dream of dominance, but of fusion. He believed, perhaps idealistically, that a new era could be born from the meeting of civilizations. The road stretched onward, through the Zagros Mountains, across the plains of Media, into the unknown territories beyond the Oxus River. But wherever he went, Alexander brought with him more than soldiers. He carried ideas, the geometry of Euclid, the ethics of Socrates, the stories of Euripides and Aeschylus. These ideas settled into the soils of Central Asia and India, gently influencing art, architecture, language and learning. The imprint of Greece spread not as conquest alone, but as quiet memory, in coins, in columns, in the lines of a well-shaped amphitheater under eastern stars. By the time Alexander reached the Indus Valley, the known world had been redrawn. But even as his empire expanded, his time began to shorten. In the next section, we follow the final leg of his journey through India and then home again, and the legacy he left behind, not a lasting empire, but a cultural horizon that would stretch for centuries, long after the man himself had passed from sight. The journey eastward continued, always forward, always deeper into the unknown. By the year 327 BCE, Alexander and his army had crossed the great sweep of the Persian Empire and entered the lands of India, where new rivers carved unfamiliar paths through thick forests, and where monsoon rains softened the dry certainty of earlier campaigns. To the Greeks, these lands felt distant and dreamlike, peopled with strange animals, rich in spices and gemstones, shaped by rulers with unfamiliar titles and palaces adorned in different styles. And yet, Alexander moved with the same steady curiosity he had shown before. He was not driven solely by conquest now, but by the idea of completing a vision to touch the very edges of the world as it was known. In India, he met resistance and wonder in equal measure. The most significant of these encounters came at the Hydaspes River, where a local king named Polis stood with his own army to block Alexander's advance. Unlike many before him, Polis did not retreat or submit. His forces included elephants, majestic and terrifying to the Macedonians, who had never faced them in battle. The clash was fierce and difficult, fought under pounding rain and deep mud. Yet Alexander prevailed, not through brute force, but through tactical patience and a carefully timed crossing of the river. Polis, though defeated, was not humiliated. Impressed by his courage and dignity, Alexander restored him to his kingdom and even expanded his domain, a gesture that echoed the young king's consistent preference for respect over revenge. But this battle, though victorious, marked a quiet turning point. The men who had followed Alexander for years across Anatolia, Egypt, Persia, and into Central Asia had grown weary. Their strength was not gone, but their longing for home had grown louder than their hunger for glory. When Alexander spoke of pushing farther east into lands even he had never seen, his soldiers refused. It was not rebellion, but quiet resolve. They had gone far enough. They had seen enough. Even the greatest vision, it seemed, must bend eventually to the will of weary hearts. Alexander listened. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, the easternmost reach of his campaign, he made sacrifices to the gods, marked the boundary of his journey, and turned westward at last. The return was long and difficult, moving southward along the Indus River, then west across the Gedrosian Desert, a harsh and arid land where heat and thirst claimed more lives than battle ever had. It was a reminder that nature, too, held power beyond armies. The hardships of the desert scarred the memory of the return, and the man who reached Babylon in 324 BCE was not the same as the youth who had first crossed into Asia a decade earlier. By then, Alexander's empire stretched from the Ionian Sea to the Indus Valley, a span larger than any Greek had ruled before. But it was an empire held together more by his presence than by institutions. He had tried to unify it through language, cities, and shared culture. He had married a woman of Central Asia, Roxana, and encouraged his officers to marry local women. He had adopted certain elements of Persian court life, to the discomfort of many Macedonians, believing that unity could only come through fusion. In Susa, he had orchestrated a mass wedding of Macedonian officers and Persian noble women, a symbolic attempt to bind together two worlds. But symbols, however elegant, do not always hold firm against the pressures of loyalty and fear. Beneath the surface, tensions brewed. His return to Babylon, the ancient city of brick towers and hanging gardens, was meant to be a time of planning. He spoke of new conquests, of Arabia, of the Western Mediterranean, and of building harbors and roads to knit his empire together. He commissioned new maps, gathered scholars, and welcomed ambassadors from as far away as Carthage and southern Italy. The palace buzzed with anticipation, but the rhythm of Alexander's life was no longer his to shape. In June of 323 BCE, after a night of feasting and days of growing fever, Alexander fell ill. The exact cause has never been certain. Some speak of malaria, others of typhoid, still others of poison, but no single explanation has ever fully satisfied the quiet mystery of his death. He lingered for days, unable to speak, surrounded by his generals, who looked to him for a sign. When asked to whom he left his empire, he is said to have replied, with a faint breath, to the strongest. He died at the age of 32. The grief that followed was deep and unsteady, with no clear heir. His son by Roxana would not be born until after his death. The empire began to fracture. His generals, the Diadochi, divided his territories among themselves, carving the vast dominion into pieces. Wars of succession followed. Cities changed hands, loyalties shifted. The political unity Alexander had tried to craft dissolved quickly, as power returned to the hands of many. And yet, something deeper endured. In the cities he had founded, in the libraries that grew under his name, in the temples that bore Greek inscriptions beside Eastern symbols, the cultural blending he had initiated continued. Greek art, literature, and language became embedded in lands that had once known only Persian, Aramaic, or Sanskrit. The Hellenistic world was born not through borders, but through exchange, a world in which Greek philosophy was studied in Egyptian temples and Babylonian astronomy influenced Greek science. Trade routes widened, ideas mingled, the classical spirit lived on, not just in Greece but in Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamon, and Bactria. Alexander's empire may have broken apart, but his influence lingered in every conversation between East and West, every blend of architecture and scripture, every coin that bore both Greek letters and local deities. His life had reshaped the known world, not into one ruled vision, but into a new horizon of possibility. In the next section we return to the Greek mainland and trace the legacy of the Hellenistic world, the cities that grew, the knowledge that expanded, and the quiet transformation of Greece itself, now a part of something far larger than it had ever imagined. In the years after Alexander's death, the map of the known world no longer returned to its earlier shapes. Borders shifted, kingdoms rose and fell, but the changes that had begun during his great campaign were not easily undone. The threads of Greek culture, thought, and language had been carried across rivers and mountains, deserts and valleys, and now they quietly took root. The result was a new chapter in the story of Greece, not a decline nor a continuation, but a transformation. It was a world that spoke Greek but dreamed in many dialects, the Hellenistic world. The heart of this new era did not lie in Athens or Sparta alone. Instead, it pulsed across a network of cities that stretched from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Nile and the foothills of the Hindu Kush. These cities were not colonies in the old sense, nor were they simply military outposts. They were living centers of culture, commerce, and exchange, places where people from many lands gathered, traded, taught, and learned. In them, the Greek polis evolved into something more cosmopolitan, more layered, and more intertwined with the lands around it. Nowhere was this more evident than in Alexandria, the gleaming city at the mouth of the Nile. Founded by Alexander, but brought to grandeur under his successors, especially the Ptolemaic dynasty, Alexandria became the jewel of the Hellenistic world. Its harbor welcomed ships from across the Mediterranean and Red Sea. Its streets echoed with many tongues: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, all interwoven in the daily rhythm of a diverse and growing population. But it was not only trade that flourished. Alexandria became a sanctuary for learning, home to the most famous library of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, though often romanticized, was very real, a vast repository of scrolls collected from across the known world. The rulers of Alexandria spared no effort to acquire texts, works of poetry, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. Every ship that docked in the harbor was searched for books, which were copied and studied. The scholars who worked there came from many lands, and together they advanced the knowledge of their time with quiet diligence. It was here that Euclid organized the principles of geometry with clarity that would endure for millennia. It was here that Eratosthenes, by measuring the shadows cast by the sun in two distant cities, estimated the circumference of the earth with striking accuracy, not through magic or myth, but through thoughtful observation and careful reasoning. Elsewhere in the Hellenistic world, similar centers of learning emerged. In Pergamon, a grand library rivaled that of Alexandria. In Rhodes, astronomers charted the heavens with intricate instruments. In Antioch, scholars explored philosophy and literature with equal curiosity. These were not merely Greek cities, but Hellenistic ones, shaped by Greek influence, but enriched by the traditions and knowledge of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and beyond. Art, too, transformed. The sculptors of the classical era had sought balance and idealized form. In the Hellenistic period, emotion and movement came to the fore. Statues now showed not only gods and heroes in poised perfection, but everyday people in quiet moments: an old woman with a basket, a child in play, a warrior in the act of dying. There was a gentle humanity to these works, a reflection of a world more complex, more connected, and more conscious of individual experience. Philosophy continued to flourish, but its focus subtly shifted. In earlier times, philosophers had often been concerned with the ideal state, the structure of justice, the order of the cosmos. Now, in an age where the polis no longer held the same central role in daily life, questions of personal ethics came to the forefront. The Stoics, building on ideas from earlier thinkers, taught that peace could be found through reason and self-discipline, by aligning one's life with the natural order and accepting what lay beyond control. The Epicureans, meanwhile, offered a gentler view, encouraging the pursuit of simple pleasures, friendship, and freedom from fear. These schools of thought were not lofty abstractions. They were guides for life in a changing world, for merchants and sailors, for scribes and rulers, for anyone trying to navigate a time of great mobility and cultural blending. In the porticos of cities, in private gardens and shaded courtyards, these ideas were shared quietly, shaping inner worlds just as new architecture shaped the outer. Even as the Greek mainland remained politically fragmented, with smaller leagues, shifting alliances, and rising Roman influence, its identity continued to evolve. Athens was no longer a political leader, but it remained a revered center of learning. The Academy of Plato and the Lyceum of Aristotle continued to teach. The legacy of Socrates lived on in dialogue and introspection. The theater still echoed with new dramas, even as older plays were performed with renewed meaning. In Sparta, change came slowly, but it came. Once a city of rigid tradition and isolation, it now found itself drawn into broader currents. Even in decline, the echoes of its austere past held fascination for others, particularly the Romans, who admired Spartan discipline even as they followed their own path of expansion. And through it all, the Greek language became a thread that tied the vast tapestry of the Hellenistic world together. Known as Koine Greek, this common dialect spread far and wide, used in trade, administration, scholarship, and even religion. It would become the language of the New Testament, the language in which Jewish and Christian thinkers would write, and the medium through which science, philosophy, and myth would travel for centuries to come. The Hellenistic world was not eternal. Over time, the rising power of Rome would slowly absorb these lands, not with sudden destruction, but with steady integration. The Greek kingdoms, divided among Alexander's former generals and their descendants, would eventually yield to the Roman Republic, and later the Roman Empire. But Greece as an idea, as a spirit of inquiry and beauty, did not vanish. It was carried forward, first by the Romans, then by others, always evolving, always returning. In the next section, we follow the slow merging of Greek and Roman worlds, not as a loss but as a transformation, and how the legacy of ancient Greece quietly endured within the heart of a changing empire. There is a kind of legacy that does not demand recognition, that lingers not through declarations or monuments alone, but through the soft passage of ideas, carried in speech, in stone, in the structure of thought. As the Hellenistic kingdoms aged and the Roman Republic rose, Greece entered such a phase of quiet endurance. Though the balance of political power shifted westward, the cultural heart of the Mediterranean still beat in rhythms shaped by Athens, by Alexandria, by the soft lyricism of Homer, and the sharp questions of Socrates. Rome, rising steadily from its hills beside the Tiber, would not erase this inheritance. It would in many ways embrace it. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman influence had expanded into the eastern Mediterranean. One by one, the Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, Ptolemaic Egypt, entered the Roman sphere, either through conquest or treaty. But these were not violent upheavals of culture. Instead, the Romans, though often stern in battle and law, came as eager students of the Greek world. Their generals admired Greek discipline and aesthetics. Their philosophers quoted Plato. Their architects studied the columns of the Parthenon. Their poets learned meter from Hesiod and form from Sappho. Greece, now a province, remained a teacher. In cities like Corinth and Ephesus, Greek art and drama continued to flourish, now with Roman patrons in attendance. In Athens, Roman elites sent their sons to study rhetoric, ethics, and history, walking the same stone paths once tread by Pericles and Aristotle. The schools, the academy, the lyceum, the stoa continued, not in defiance of Rome, but with its support. Emperors themselves sought the wisdom of Greece. Julius Caesar wept at the statue of Alexander. Augustus adorned his capital with marble in the Greek style. Hadrian, centuries later, would walk the streets of Athens not as a conqueror, but as a lover of its legacy, funding temples and libraries in homage to the civilization that had taught Rome how to think. Under Roman rule, Greek cities often retained their own laws and customs. The agora remained a place of gathering, though Latin now mingled with Koine Greek in conversation. Temples still rose to Athena and Apollo, their rituals quietly continuing even as Roman deities shared the stage. In Alexandria, the great library continued to collect texts. Its scholars, now under Roman protection, expanded their inquiries, exploring medicine, mechanics, and the stars. The fusion of Greek and Roman thought gave rise to new systems of logic, new texts of ethics, and new ways of seeing the world that would influence not only the empire, but the civilizations that followed. Perhaps nowhere was this synthesis more visible than in education. Across the Roman Empire, Greek became the language of the learned. Roman authors such as Cicero, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius were deeply influenced by Greek philosophy. The Stoics, whose roots lay in the shaded colonnades of Athens, found favor among Roman statesmen and soldiers alike. Their teachings, that virtue lay in reason, that the universe had an order, that one must accept fate with dignity, offered calm in the chaos of imperial life. In private villas and public forums, such ideas were not taught as ancient relics, but as living guides. Greek medicine too lived on. The works of Hippocrates and Galen were studied in Roman clinics and copied by scribes for generations. Geometry, taught through Euclid's principles, informed Roman engineering. Astronomy, once practiced on the rooftops of roads, helped shape calendars, navigation, and agriculture across a sprawling empire. The heritage of Greek science became embedded in the practical life of Rome, no longer separate from governance or trade, but a quiet current beneath its achievements. Even Greek religion found its place. While Roman gods often mirrored Greek counterparts, Jupiter for Zeus, Venus for Aphrodite, the older myths remained deeply respected. Festivals continued. Oracles were consulted. Epic poetry was recited in theaters and private homes alike. In many ways, the Roman soul was clothed in a Greek garment, tailored anew with each generation. Back in Greece, daily life adjusted to its new context. The polis no longer held the same political authority, but it remained the center of social and cultural life. In cities like Athens, Delos, and Thessaloniki, the rhythms of festivals, schooling, and communal worship continued. Local councils administered civic matters. Theaters still hosted dramas and music. The streets, though now lined with Roman stone, still followed the contours laid down in older days, a soft continuity from past to present. And as Christianity slowly emerged and spread across the empire, Greek once again played a central role. The earliest Christian texts were written in Greek. The Gospels, the letters of Paul, the theological writings of early church thinkers, all flowed in the same language that once carried the ideas of Plato and Pindar. This new faith, though born in the eastern provinces, would draw heavily on the intellectual traditions of Greece to shape its doctrines and teachings. In time, Greek philosophy would become part of Christian theology, and Greek cities would host councils that defined the future of the church. Thus, even as the world around Greece changed, as legions marched, as emperors ruled, as cities rose and fell, the essence of Greek civilization endured. Not in defiance, but in gentle absorption, like ink drawn into paper, leaving behind patterns both new and familiar. In the next section, we follow this enduring spirit into the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as Byzantium, where Greek thought, language, and tradition would find sanctuary once more, and where the quiet glow of antiquity would continue to burn long after the Western world had dimmed. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century CE, it did so with a slow and crumbling hush rather than a sudden fall. Cities faded, roads grew quiet, and imperial authority withered under the weight of repeated invasions and internal decay. But in the east, where the sun rose over the Aegean Sea and the great markets of Antioch, Ephesus, and Alexandria still bustled, the story was different. There, a new chapter began, one that looked westward toward Rome for its name, but back toward Greece for its soul. The Eastern Roman Empire, known later by scholars as the Byzantine Empire, was Roman in law and title, but unmistakably Greek in language, culture, and spirit. Its heart beat in Constantinople, the city founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 CE. Strategically perched between Europe and Asia, surrounded on three sides by water, Constantinople became the capital of an empire that would endure for over 1,000 years. In its streets and palaces, in its churches and libraries, the quiet memory of classical Greece lived on, not frozen in the past, but alive in new forms, woven into faith and framed by new questions. The people of Byzantium spoke Greek, not Latin, in their homes, in their markets, and in their schools. The language of Homer, Plato, and Herodotus remained the language of law, of literature, and of learning. In monasteries, scribes carefully copied ancient manuscripts, preserving not only religious texts but the works of Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen. These copies would later travel across time and place, carried into the Islamic world, then into Renaissance Europe, helping to ignite rediscoveries that would shape the modern age. In Byzantium, these texts were not rediscoveries. They were heritage, familiar, respected, and quietly enduring. In education, the Greek tradition lived on with quiet strength. The curriculum of classical antiquity, grammar, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy continued to form the backbone of scholarly life. Students learned to recite poetry, analyze argument, and interpret sacred scripture through the lens of both ancient wisdom and Christian theology. The schools of Constantinople, including the Imperial University founded in the 5th century, taught the classics alongside Christian doctrine, forming a bridge between old and new that few empires have ever sustained so gracefully. Art and architecture, too, bore the marks of this continuity. The grand mosaics of Byzantine churches glowed with gold and deep color, yet their designs echoed older Greek principles of symmetry and harmony. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 537 under Emperor Justinian, soared with domes and arches that seemed to defy gravity. Though a Christian basilica, its architectural language drew from ancient engineering and aesthetic balance, a soft continuation of the Greek love of form, now transfigured in service of divine mystery. When light poured in through its high windows and danced across its marble floors, it carried with it echoes of Delphi and Athens, now reborn in a new spiritual key. Philosophy, though now reframed by Christian theology, retained its central place in Byzantine intellectual life. Thinkers such as John Philoponus challenged earlier cosmologies, critiquing Aristotelian physics while preserving its method of inquiry. Others, like Michael Psellos, blended Neoplatonic thought with orthodox spirituality, writing in the elegant Attic Greek that still held sway in scholarly circles. The Greek ideal of seeking truth, through reason, through observation, through contemplation, was never extinguished. It simply shifted its focus, turning upward to the heavens as often as inward to the soul. Religion became the framework through which most of this culture now flowed. The Greek Orthodox Church, rooted in Greek language and ritual, became both a spiritual and cultural anchor. Its liturgy, sung in Greek, its theology articulated with Greek vocabulary, and its iconography shaped by centuries of aesthetic evolution, all reflected a continuity with the past. Saints replaced sages, but the reverence for wisdom endured. In Byzantine hymns and sermons, one can still hear the cadence of classical rhetoric, softened by the gentler rhythm of prayer. Even the concept of imperial rule, so central to both Greek and Roman political thought, found new form in the Byzantine emperor, a figure seen as God's representative on earth. Emperors like Justinian, who codified Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, saw themselves not only as rulers, but as caretakers of a legacy. The laws, The schools, the rituals of state, all carried with them the fingerprints of Athens, of Corinth, of the Agora, and the Academy. In Byzantium, empire was not only power, it was memory. Of course, the world outside Byzantium changed. The Islamic Caliphates rose in the east, preserving and expanding Greek science and philosophy in Arabic. In the west, Latin faded as the lingua franca, and Europe entered what historians would later call the Middle Ages. But Byzantium remained, not untouched, but unbroken, a keeper of classical light in a world where that light sometimes flickered. It was not a static civilization. Over the centuries, the empire would face siege and invasion, internal strife and theological conflict. Icons would be banned and restored, borders would contract and expand. Yet through these changes, the Greek spirit remained embedded in the foundation of Byzantine life, not through monuments alone, but in words spoken, thoughts shared, and questions asked across generations. As the Middle Ages unfolded, and as new powers emerged in the West, Byzantium became both bridge and beacon. Its scholars, especially in later centuries, would carry manuscripts westward as the empire began to fade, lighting the spark of the Renaissance in cities like Florence and Venice. But within Byzantium itself, those texts had never been forgotten. They had always been present, always recited, always remembered. In the next section, we follow that final turning, the slow end of Byzantium and the passing of its light into new hands. From Constantinople's fall to the rise of Renaissance thought in Western Europe, we trace how the wisdom of ancient Greece was never lost, but carefully, quietly handed down, like a flame passed from one lamp to another, illuminating the world anew. By the middle of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire had become a shadow of its former self. Its territory had shrunk to little more than the city of Constantinople, with a few scattered outposts clinging to the Aegean and Black Sea coasts. Once the beating heart of the Eastern Roman world, the empire had endured siege and sorrow, treaty and triumph for more than 1,000 years. But now, surrounded by the growing might of the Ottoman Empire, Byzantium stood as a last flicker, a lamp still burning amid winds of change. The fall came in 1453, after months of siege by the forces of Sultan Mehmed II. Ottoman cannons pounded the ancient walls, while defenders inside, vastly outnumbered and under-resourced, held on with determination and solemn courage. For weeks, the city resisted. Its mosaics still shimmered in candlelight. The call to prayer and hymn echoed through the streets. But on May 29th, the final breach was made. The gates fell. The empire came to an end. It was a moment that shook the Christian world, the loss of a sacred city, the last remnant of Roman imperial glory. And yet, for all the grief it brought, the fall of Constantinople did not silence the voice of Greece. It carried that voice westward, in the minds and manuscripts of the scholars who fled the city in its final days. Across the Adriatic Sea, into Venice, Florence, and Rome, they traveled, bringing with them the knowledge of centuries. They came not as conquerors but as caretakers, bearers of books, teachers of ancient tongues, guardians of thought. These émigré scholars carried texts that had never been seen in Western Europe, works of Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Ptolemy in their original Greek, complete and intact. They brought with them not just the content of those works, but the context, the ability to read, interpret, and teach in the classical tradition. Their arrival helped ignite what would come to be known as the Renaissance, the rebirth, a flowering of art, science, and philosophy rooted in the soil of antiquity. In Italy, the response was immediate and profound. Humanist scholars such as Petrarch, who had long revered the wisdom of the ancients, now had access to sources that deepened and expanded their understanding. Greek, once largely unknown in the West, became a subject of eager study. Marsilio Ficino translated Plato into Latin, and the Platonic Academy in Florence drew inspiration from the quiet echoes of Athenian dialogue. Painters, architects, and poets all found in Greek thought a wellspring of proportion, harmony, and ideal form. The Parthenon's columns found their reflections in Renaissance facades. The tragedies of Sophocles whispered in the dramas of Shakespeare. The scientific method, sharpened by Greek logic, helped guide thinkers like Copernicus and Galileo toward the stars. It was not only in Italy that this revival took hold. Across Europe, in France, England, the Low Countries, and eventually beyond, the legacy of Greece stirred quietly back to life. And yet, it had never truly died. It had lived in the careful hands of Byzantine scribes, in the lessons taught under candlelight, in the words recited in monastic cells overlooking the Bosporus. It had waited patiently, not for grandeur but for listening ears. Ironically, even as Greek thought moved westward, it continued to flourish in the East, now under Ottoman rule. The Ottomans, while Islamic in faith and distinctly different in culture, recognized the value of the city they had taken. Constantinople was renamed Istanbul, but it remained a great center of learning and trade. Greek Orthodox communities continued their traditions. Schools were maintained. Greek remained a spoken and written language in many corners of the empire. The legacy of Plato and Aristotle lived on not only in Christian monasteries and Renaissance courts, but in the libraries of Islamic scholars and the studies of Jewish philosophers, each interpreting and adapting Greek thought through the lens of their own traditions. In the centuries that followed, the memory of Byzantium itself became something of a legend, a long twilight between ancient glory and modern emergence. But for the people who had lived it, and for those who preserved it, it was something far more human. It was daily life shaped by ancient rhythms. It was ritual and language, structure and memory, practiced not as heritage alone but as habit, as living breath passed from parent to child, from teacher to pupil, from voice to page. In the quiet spaces between empires, the flame of Greece had been carried, carefully, faithfully. And now it lit the halls of universities in Paris, the workshops of Florence, the studies of curious minds across a changing Europe. As we move into the next section, we follow the path of that flame as it glows into modernity, from Enlightenment thinkers to revolutionary ideals, from museum halls to modern classrooms. The journey of ancient Greece, it seems, did not end in marble ruins or dusty scrolls. It continues softly wherever someone asks a question, sketches a form, or dreams of a better world. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the world had changed beyond what the citizens of Athens or Alexandria could have imagined. Empires had risen and fallen. New continents had been explored. The printing press had reshaped the spread of knowledge. Yet amid this new age of movement and discovery, the voice of ancient Greece continued to whisper, in universities, in drawing rooms, in the quiet corners of libraries, where the worn pages of Plato and Thucydides still turned beneath curious fingers. The Enlightenment, which unfolded across Europe during the 18th century, was a time of reawakening, a deliberate reaching back toward the clarity, order, and rational inquiry so deeply rooted in Greek tradition. Thinkers across the continent turned to the ancients, not with blind reverence, but with inspired curiosity. They saw in the city-states of Greece, especially Athens, an early model of civic participation, freedom of thought, and the pursuit of knowledge. It was not a golden past to be recreated in full, but a starting point, a spark that could guide the modern world into reasoned governance, ethical debate, and scientific exploration. In France, Voltaire and Diderot praised the Greek philosophers as models of intellectual independence. In England, Isaac Newton built upon the geometric logic of Euclid and the mechanical inquiries of Archimedes. In Germany, Immanuel Kant drew from both Aristotle and the Stoics in shaping his ethical systems. The Stoic emphasis on duty and inner reason resonated in a world striving for order in the face of political upheaval and religious change. In salons and academies, Greek ideals were debated, adapted, and folded into new visions of society. Perhaps nowhere was the Greek ideal more quietly powerful than in the emerging concepts of democracy and citizenship. The Athenian model, flawed, exclusive, but undeniably radical, inspired writers and revolutionaries in both Europe and the Americas. The United States, in its founding documents and early institutions, looked back to Athens and Rome alike. The columns of the Capitol, the oratory of the Senate, the architecture of courthouses and libraries, all bore the marks of classical form. But the inspiration was not only visual. The very idea that the citizen had a role in shaping the laws, that governance required participation, dialogue, and accountability, was lifted from Greek soil and reinterpreted for a new age. As the Enlightenment gave way to Romanticism in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the legacy of Greece changed tone once more. No longer seen only as a rational beacon, Greece became a landscape of feeling, a place of poetic ruin, tragic beauty, and heroic memory. The crumbling temples and scattered marble of the Greek countryside became symbols of something deeper, the passage of time, the endurance of spirit, the delicate balance between glory and loss. Poets such as Lord Byron wandered among the ruins of Delphi and Sparta, writing verses that mourned the fallen grandeur of a people who once shaped the world. Artists painted sunlit acropolises and wind-blown columns, not as monuments, but as dreams, fragments of a purer age that had somehow lingered. In Romantic music, too, composers drew from Greek themes and myth, setting the lives of Oedipus or Orpheus to music that swelled with longing. Greece, in this era, became less a model and more a muse, a quiet companion to the modern imagination. During this time, the people of Greece themselves were not forgotten. Under Ottoman rule since the 15th century, they had maintained their language, their traditions, and their stories. By the early 19th century, movements toward independence had begun to stir. Inspired in part by the classical past, Greek revolutionaries saw themselves as heirs to a proud legacy, one not of empire, but of autonomy, artistry, and resilience. When the Greek War of Independence began in 1821, it captured the hearts of many in Europe. Artists and intellectuals, particularly in Britain and France, rallied to the cause, seeing in modern Greece not only a political struggle, but a symbolic one, the return of a lost voice to the stage of history. Lord Byron himself sailed to Greece, offering not only poems but personal support. He died in Missolonghi in 1824, becoming a kind of modern Homeric figure, a foreigner who gave his life for an ideal rooted in both myth and modern hope. The war eventually led to the recognition of an independent Greek state in 1830, and while its early years were shaped by complexity and challenge, the symbolic power of its revival was felt across the Western world. Greece, long a subject of study and song, had once again become a participant in its own future. In academic life, the study of classics, Latin and Greek language, literature and philosophy became the cornerstone of higher education in Europe and North America. Young scholars learned to read Herodotus and Xenophon, to debate Socratic dialogues, and to trace the structures of ancient syntax. The university itself, as an institution, bore deep roots in the scholastic traditions that flowed through Greek inquiry, a space where knowledge was pursued for its own sake, through careful questioning and shared learning. Architecture, too, experienced a revival of classical influence. In city halls and museums, in banks and libraries, Greek motifs returned with quiet grandeur. The Greek revival style, with its tall columns, pediments, and sense of proportion, became a symbol not only of beauty, but of dignity, order, and civic pride. Across continents, cities looked to ancient Athens for inspiration, even as their realities remained deeply modern. Science and mathematics, once reborn in the Renaissance through the lens of Greek inquiry, now found new pathways. The geometry of Euclid, the anatomical insights of Galen, the logic of Aristotle, all informed modern disciplines, guiding the structure of experiments, the design of proofs, the framing of hypotheses. These were not ancient curiosities, but quiet foundations beneath the visible progress of the modern world. And yet, for all its influence, Greece remained more than a source of forms and formulas. It remained a story of people striving for meaning, of cities rising in dialogue, of minds seeking harmony between reason and wonder. In every corner of modern culture touched by this legacy, from philosophy classrooms to sculpture studios, from courtrooms to operas, the presence of Greece endures, not loudly, but steadily, like a familiar rhythm beneath the noise of time. In the next section, we explore how the legacy of ancient Greece continues to shape our present, not only in intellectual tradition, but in the quiet choices of daily life, in the ways we think, speak, and imagine what it means to live well in a shared world. There are legacies that announce themselves in grand monuments and formal ceremonies, but there are others that live more quietly, in the patterns of thought, the shape of a sentence, the way a question is asked or a life is examined. The legacy of ancient Greece belongs to the latter. It does not press itself upon the present, but instead flows through it, a gentle undercurrent beneath the fast-moving stream of modern life. In education, the Greek tradition remains especially present. The very idea of school as a place for structured learning, for dialogue, for the pursuit of understanding rather than mere utility, finds its roots in the shaded groves of Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum. There, long ago, students gathered not simply to memorize facts, but to question, to reflect, and to build knowledge together. The Socratic method, built on asking thoughtful, open-ended questions, is still used in classrooms, law schools, and seminars around the world. It teaches not what to think, but how, encouraging clarity, humility, and the capacity to listen. The structure of modern philosophy itself owes much to the Greeks. When we ask what it means to live a good life, to act justly, to know something with certainty, we are repeating questions first posed more than 2,000 years ago. In thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, we find not answers set in stone, but frameworks, starting points for exploration. Their categories of thought, from ethics and metaphysics to logic and aesthetics, continue to shape how modern philosophers work. Even as contemporary philosophy branches into fields like existentialism, phenomenology, and analytic reasoning, the roots remain deeply Greek. Political thought, too, still breathes with ancient influence. The vocabulary of democracy, demos, the people, kratos, power, is Greek. The idea that laws should be made through debate, that leaders should be accountable to those they govern, and that citizenship carries both rights and responsibilities, all emerged in the public spaces of Athens. Though Athenian democracy was far from perfect, limited to a narrow group of free male citizens, it set a precedent for participatory government that has been studied, admired, and adapted by societies across the world. In modern constitutions, senates, and assemblies, the echoes of Greek governance remain. In the separation of powers, in the idea of the rule of law, and in the practice of public deliberation, we find patterns first tested in the stone amphitheaters and council chambers of the classical world. Even the architectural language of these institutions, columns, domes, balance in form, draws from Greek ideals of order, proportion, and harmony. The field of ethics continues to be shaped by ancient models as well. Contemporary discussions of virtue, responsibility, and the good life often revisit the Aristotelian concept of flourishing, eudaimonia, which suggests that well-being arises not from pleasure or wealth alone, but from the cultivation of character. The virtues, courage, temperance, wisdom, justice, are still taught, still debated, still held up as measures of moral development. In everyday choices and professional conduct, in medicine and law, in politics and education, we find ourselves guided by standards that trace a long, gentle arc back to ancient Greece. In science and mathematics, the contributions of the Greeks are not only preserved in history, but integrated into the very structure of knowledge. Geometry, first formalized by Euclid, remains foundational in classrooms today. The methods of observation and classification developed by Aristotle laid early groundwork for biology. The ethical considerations in medicine recall the Hippocratic Oath, still referenced in contemporary versions of medical ethics. Though the sciences have advanced far beyond the ancient world, the shape of inquiry, the desire to understand nature through reason and evidence, is deeply rooted in Greek beginnings. Language itself carries countless Greek footprints. In English and many other languages, Greek words form the backbone of disciplines: philosophy, democracy, biology, astronomy, logic, poetry, theater. The very concept of an encyclopedia, a circle of learning, is Greek in origin. Even in daily life, when we speak of panic, of euphoria, of nostalgia, of politics or aesthetics, we are using echoes of words first spoken centuries ago. In the arts, the influence of Greece is more than inspiration, it is structural. The dramatic forms of tragedy and comedy, shaped on the stages of ancient Athens, continue in theater and cinema today. The three-act structure, the themes of hubris and catharsis, the arc of a flawed hero, all reflect patterns established by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. In sculpture and painting, the search for balance, ideal beauty, and expressive form carries forward from Greek models. Museums around the world still draw crowds to marble torsos and painted vases, not as relics, but as encounters with something timeless and quietly human. In religion and spirituality too, Greek influence can be felt. Many early Christian thinkers were deeply trained in Greek philosophy. The Gospels were written in Koine Greek. The theological writings of Origen, Clement of Alexandria, and the Cappadocian Fathers shaped Christian doctrine using Greek philosophical tools. Concepts of soul, reason, and virtue were woven into spiritual teachings. Even outside of religious belief, the legacy of Greek metaphysics continues to inform how many modern people think about existence, purpose, and the nature of reality. But perhaps most enduring of all is the Greek belief that knowledge, beauty, and goodness are connected, that to learn is not only to know more, but to become more human. This ideal of the full development of mind and character still shapes the goals of liberal education. It still animates conversations in homes, schools, and public discourse. It still offers a quiet reminder that wisdom is not merely technical or practical, but deeply moral and deeply shared. In times of uncertainty or change, people often return to these foundations, not for nostalgia, but for orientation. The Greeks did not give the modern world all its answers, but they gave it a habit of asking, of listening, of refining the questions. They gave it myths and methods, stories and systems, poetry, and practice. As we continue through the centuries, the presence of Greece remains, not in one place or in one voice, but scattered across disciplines, continents, and languages. In the next section, we reflect on how ancient Greece continues to inspire not only institutions and ideas, but personal lives, the quiet way it touches how we see the world, how we imagine ourselves, and how we find meaning in being human. Across the span of time, through windswept ruins and ink-stained scrolls, the story of ancient Greece has carried itself not with urgency, but with calm resilience. It has moved through the world like a slow and steady tide, never rushing, never retreating fully, but always returning, shaping the shores of thought, art, governance, and memory. Now, as we pause in this quiet section of our journey, we look back across that arc, not with nostalgia, but with quiet appreciation, seeing how far we've come. We began with the land itself, the rocky peninsulas, the olive-covered hills, the countless islands scattered across a blue and glimmering sea. This landscape, broken and beautiful, shaped the people who lived upon it. It made them sailors, traders, farmers, storytellers. It encouraged independence, the formation of city-states, and a kind of fragmented unity held together not by empire, but by language, religion, and shared tradition. Even in its earliest days, with the Minoans of Crete, the Mycenaeans of the mainland, and the oral poets of a slowly awakening world, Greece was already becoming a place of complexity, curiosity, and quiet strength. As centuries turned, the polis emerged, the Greek city-state, at once a community and a symbol, a place of commerce and conversation, of worship and citizenship. We walked the streets of Athens, where the invention of democracy began, not as a sudden leap, but as a series of careful reforms, public debates, and experiments in shared responsibility. We stood in the agora, where citizens discussed law, philosophy, and poetry beneath the open sky. We sat in the theater, where dramas gave voice to the hopes and griefs of a people trying to understand themselves. Through this golden age, we met the minds that still walk beside us: Socrates, questioning gently; Plato, dreaming of forms and ideal cities; Aristotle, observing the natural world with patient eyes. These were not voices seeking fame, but clarity. They asked not how to conquer others, but how to live with integrity, how to build a life that mattered. And though their answers differed, their method, the gentle insistence on asking, listening, refining, has become one of Greece's most enduring gifts. But Greece was not only Athens. We followed the rise of Sparta, austere and inward-looking, its values shaped by discipline and duty. We moved through the waves of war, with Persia, with each other, and we watched the long, slow erosion of certainty as conflict took its toll. The Peloponnesian War taught not only of strategy and power, but of pride, loss, and the fragility of idealism in the face of fear. Yet even in defeat, Athens remained a sanctuary of thought. The flame dimmed, but did not go out. From there we turned north, to Macedon, where Philip II and his son Alexander carried Greek culture far beyond its borders. We followed Alexander eastward, across Asia Minor, through Egypt, into Persia and India, not merely as a conqueror, but as a bridge between worlds. Through the cities he founded and the traditions he brought together, the Hellenistic world was born, a world where Greek language and ideas mingled with those of Egypt, Babylon, and beyond. It was not unity through force, but through gentle exchange, through the patient work of scholars, builders, and artists. The thread did not break. It continued into Rome, which absorbed and admired the Greek way, building temples in Greek styles, teaching children in Greek philosophy, and writing poetry in imitation of Greek epics. The Roman Empire became a vessel for Greek heritage, carrying it westward and weaving it into the very fabric of Western civilization. And when Rome's western half fell, the thread passed east into Byzantium, into Constantinople, where Greek remained the language of law, learning, and liturgy. There, under golden domes and flickering candles, the wisdom of Plato and the syntax of Homer continued to live, not as relics, but as part of a living faith and daily rhythm. When Byzantium too faded, the torch was passed again, this time to the scholars who carried Greek manuscripts to Renaissance Europe, breathing new life into art, architecture, science, and thought. We traced how Greece inspired the architects of democracy and the poets of Romanticism, how its memory stirred revolutions and reawakened the human longing for balance, proportion, and meaning. And then, gently, we turn to the present, where Greece lives not in marble alone, but in minds and hearts, in the way we teach, in the words we speak, in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we hope to become. In modern philosophy, medicine, ethics, and politics, the questions once asked in the shade of olive trees are still being asked by children in classrooms, by thinkers in universities, by individuals facing the small daily trials of being human. In each of these chapters, we have not only learned about ancient Greece, we have walked with it. We have seen that it is not a single place or time, but a series of quiet presences, threads that have slipped into the tapestry of history and wound their way, almost invisibly, into the present moment. And now, as we look ahead to the final chapters of this journey, we carry that presence with us, not as weight, but as light. The kind of light that falls softly through broken columns, the kind that gleams on painted pottery, the kind that flickers in the mind when a question is asked and no easy answer comes. In the next section, we turn our gaze gently to modern Greece, the country and the people who today carry the name and the memory, who live not in ruins, but in homes, in cafes, in classrooms and chapels, blending past and present in a living rhythm shaped by time, history, and enduring grace. To walk through modern Greece is to walk through layers, not as through a museum, but through a world still in motion, still alive. The ancient columns may stand silent in the sunlight, but beyond them, behind them, around them, life continues. Children playing in courtyards, fishermen mending their nets, elders sipping coffee slowly under the shade of sycamore trees. Greece today is not frozen in the past. It moves, it changes, but it carries its memory with care, not with weight, but with warmth. From the quiet villages tucked into mountain slopes to the vibrant hum of cities like Athens, Thessaloniki, and Patras, the past is not distant, it is present, folded into the streets, the language, the customs. A walk through an Athenian neighborhood may pass bakeries filled with the scent of sesame and honey, markets echoing with the voices of fruit sellers, and alleyways that open suddenly onto ancient stones, foundations of homes or temples that stood long before the modern buildings rose beside them. There is little fanfare. The old and the new share space like familiar neighbors. In Athens, the Acropolis still rises above the city, but it is not separate from it. The Parthenon watches over highways and rooftops, cafes and museums. At night, it glows softly, illuminated not only by lamps, but by the gaze of millions, locals and visitors alike, who see in its worn edges a kind of continuity. Beneath it, the Plaka and Monastiriki neighborhoods bustle with life, tables set for late dinners, music drifting from corners, the sound of conversation that blends modern Greek with the lilting tones of older dialects. The Greek people, oi, mili, ethin, theus, live with history, not as a curiosity, but as part of their cultural DNA. Children learn Homer in school, not as relic, but as story. Students debate Plato's ideas with the same mix of reverence and skepticism found in many nations' civic discussions. Traditional music often invokes the modes of ancient melody. Even the act of naming carries echoes. Many Greeks bear names drawn from mythology, from saints, from philosophers whose legacies linger. But modern Greece is not only heritage, it is invention, it is resilience. It is a country that has weathered occupation, economic hardship, migration and change, and yet still offers hospitality with open hands. The concept of philoxenia, love for the stranger, remains strong. In rural villages, a guest may still be greeted with bread, olives, and a small glass of tisapuro, offered not as formality, but as instinct. In urban centers, families gather around crowded tables for meals that stretch for hours, not out of luxury, but because sharing food remains an act of continuity, of love, of presence. In the Greek Orthodox Church, tradition lives on in incense and chant, in candlelight and icons. The rhythms of the liturgical calendar are woven into the life of the country, not imposed, but embraced. Holy days, fasts, and festivals remain important, connecting generations through shared ritual and song. At Easter, the midnight cry of Christos Anesti, Christ is risen, carries not just spiritual joy, but a sense of communal return, a reaffirmation of belonging that stretches backward and forward in time. Beyond religion, art and literature continue to thrive. Contemporary Greek poets and playwrights carry forward the long tradition of language used not only to describe, but to search. Writers like Odysseus, Ilitis, and Yorgos Seferis, both Nobel laureates, wrote in modern verse with ancient rhythm, drawing from myth and memory to speak to the present. Greek cinema, visual art and music all reflect a nation deeply aware of its roots, yet unafraid to explore new forms. The natural world remains central to life. The sea, the Aegean, the Ionian, the Mediterranean, is more than scenery. It is family, sustenance, journey. In island communities like Naxos, Hydra, and Crete, boats are not ornaments, but lifelines. Fishing, sailing, and ferrying continue much as they did in ages past, shaped by tides and weather, by long memory and shared knowledge. Inland, olive trees still grow in the same groves tended for generations. Grapevines twist through the soil of ancestral land. The scent of thyme, oregano, and citrus still fills the summer air. And though modernity has brought highways, high-rises, and smartphones, it has not erased the sense of time that Greeks often carry. Life, for many, moves at a different rhythm, less linear, more cyclical. There is room for slowness, for conversation, for memory. Even in cities, it is common to see people gathering, not in haste, but in ease, for coffee, for talk, for nothing in particular. This is not idleness. It is presence, a form of living that resists the pressure to rush and instead embraces continuity as a kind of quiet resistance. Challenges, of course, remain. Economic struggles, political tensions, and migration pressures have all left their marks. But through it all, the people of Greece have continued to look both inward and outward, honoring their heritage, engaging with the world, adapting without forgetting. The past is not a museum. It is a living companion, one that walks beside the present, not behind it. In the next section, we explore how the legacy of Greece continues to ripple outward, not only from within the country's borders, but through the Greek diaspora around the world, and through the global communities that continue to draw wisdom, beauty, and quiet guidance from this enduring civilization. The soul of a people is not contained by borders. It moves with them, in suitcases packed for uncertain journeys, in lullabies whispered in new languages, in the quiet rituals that follow them across oceans. So it has been for the Greek people for millennia. Even in antiquity, they were voyagers, seafarers, settlers. They founded colonies from Sicily to Cyprus, planted cities in North Africa, and sailed beyond the pillars of Heracles. The sea did not divide them, it connected them. And so, when history called for harder journeys into exile, into labor, into longing, they followed familiar winds. The modern Greek diaspora is vast, made up of millions who left the homeland during different chapters of history. Waves of migration followed war, occupation, and hardship. The Ottoman years, the Balkan Wars, the upheavals of the early 20th century, the occupation during World War II, and the civil war that followed it. In later years, economic crises pushed more to seek stability elsewhere, in Australia, Canada, the United States, Germany, South Africa, and beyond. Each departure held uncertainty. Each carried with it both sorrow and hope, sorrow for what was left behind, and hope for what might be found. They brought with them more than belongings. They brought a worldview shaped by memory, music, and myth. They carried the sound of bells ringing in mountain chapels, the smell of bread baked with olives and rosemary, the rhythms of village festivals, the words of philosophers and poets heard in childhood. These weren't just cultural details, they were anchors, ways of staying rooted while living far from the soil that had first nurtured them. In cities like Melbourne, which today hosts one of the largest Greek communities outside Greece, the language can still be heard in markets, in churchyards, in kitchens filled with the scent of cinnamon and lamb. In Toronto, Greek cafes sit quietly beside glass towers, where generations meet across tables, young voices shaped by English schooling, older ones softened by years of careful migration. In Chicago, London, Munich, and Montreal, community centers, Orthodox churches, and Greek schools continue to serve as gathering places, not just for celebration, but for continuity. These places are not imitations of Greece. They are translations, expressions of Greek life in a new language, a new setting, yet still carrying the structure of something deeply familiar. The festivals that fill summer parks in diaspora cities, with dancing, music, and endless tables of food, are more than public events. They are acts of memory. The shared steps of a traditional dance, passed from grandmother to child, carry with them a rhythm older than recollection. The melodies of the bouzouki drift not only through concert halls, but through home speakers, garage radios, and quiet apartments, linking hearts to distant hillsides and island harbors. In these communities, food is not just nourishment, it is story. Each dish recalls a region, a season, a celebration. The flakiness of spanakopita, the sweetness of galactobareko, the tang of feta paired with olives. These are not only recipes, but remnants of a life remembered through taste. Kitchens become spaces where generations gather, not only to cook, but to share language, laughter, and the often unspoken emotion of distance held tenderly. Language remains a vital thread. For many in the diaspora, Greek is not just a language spoken, it is one inherited, carried in lullabies, in prayers, in sayings passed down at the dinner table. Some families strive to preserve fluency across generations, while others hold on to fragments, certain words that refuse to fade. Philotimo, for instance, that untranslatable word that speaks of honor, integrity, and doing what is right even when no one is watching. Or kefi, the joy that arises without reason. These words live on, not as relics, but as emotional compass points. And even when the language weakens, the sense of identity often grows stronger. For many children and grandchildren of immigrants, Greece becomes not only a place on a map, but a symbol of roots, of resilience, of something to return to in times of questioning. Trips back to ancestral villages, to meet relatives, to walk through old stone homes, to swim in the waters their parents once knew, become pilgrimages of quiet belonging. Even if the local dialect is unfamiliar, the welcome is often immediate. Hospitality in Greece, and in Greek households anywhere, is not a formality, but a birthright. In the Orthodox Church, which remains a central pillar for many diaspora communities, the liturgy continues in Greek, just as it has for centuries. The chanting of ancient hymns, the scent of incense, the flicker of candlelight, these sensory echoes offer comfort, especially to elders far from their native land. But the church is not only for the old. In many places, it continues to serve as the cultural heart, where language classes are taught, youth groups gather, and stories are passed down in voices softened by both distance and devotion. The diaspora also plays a vital role in supporting Greece, financially, culturally, and politically. During times of national struggle, from the economic crisis of the 2010s to natural disasters, Greeks abroad have rallied with fundraising, advocacy, and solidarity. Donations, cultural exchanges, and ongoing ties keep the homeland and the diaspora close, even when separated by oceans. The sense of responsibility to one's village, one's relatives, one's heritage remains strong. And yet, life abroad is not just about looking back. The Greek diaspora is also a force for innovation. Greek Americans, Greek Australians, Greek Canadians, many have become leaders in business, politics, science, the arts. They carry forward their identity, not as a limitation, but as a layer, one that informs how they think, how they act, how they balance individuality with community. They are not Greeks in exile. They are Greeks in motion, part of a long tradition of movement, exchange, and adaptation. This is perhaps one of the most enduring traits of Hellenism, its ability to travel without vanishing. Like a melody that changes key but never loses its tune, Greek identity in the diaspora reshapes itself with each generation. It holds fast to what matters, to family, to memory, to the shared meal, the shared word, the shared song. In the next section, we will gather these threads, from the homeland to the diaspora, from antiquity to modernity, and reflect on Greece's place in the shared human story. We ask not what Greece was, but what it has always meant, to dream, to seek, to wonder, and to live with beauty and thought at the heart of the everyday. Across the long arc of human history, certain places become more than geography. They become voices, rhythms, ideas, not owned but shared. Ancient Greece is one of those places. Its mountains and shores, its philosophers and poets, its citizens and exiles, all together have formed not just a nation's memory, but something broader, a foundation woven into the fabric of civilization itself. Today, the legacy of Greece belongs not only to Greeks, nor only to historians, but to anyone who has ever asked a question, admired a line of poetry, sought beauty in form, or tried to live a life of meaning. It began with the land, scattered, sunlit, carved by sea and stone, a geography that nurtured small communities and independent minds. In that space of distance and dialogue, the city-state was born, the polis, a place where civic life and personal reflection could meet. The people who lived there did not always agree. They fought, they debated, they failed. But in their striving, they gave rise to something new, a model of participation, of philosophy, of artistic expression that continues to resonate softly through time. The enduring power of Greece is not in its perfection, but in its humanity. Its democracy was incomplete, its justice often flawed, its society excluded many. And yet it was the first to ask, openly, systemically, and with courage, what it meant to govern together, to think freely, to live with virtue. These questions did not disappear with the fall of empires or the erosion of marble. They were carried forward by Romans, by Byzantines, by scholars of the Islamic Golden Age, by monks and rebels, poets and dreamers, all the way into the modern world. Today we may live far from the Athenian agora or the theatres of Epidaurus, but we continue to live within the ideas they helped shape. In every constitution that defends liberty, in every classroom that encourages open thought, in every court that weighs justice, we hear the faint echo of a dialogue first spoken beneath the olive trees. Even when we do not know the names, Solon, Pericles, Antigone, Socrates, their shadows fall softly over the structures of modern life. This is the quiet generosity of the Greek tradition. It does not demand attention. It offers itself gently, in shapes and rhythms we have come to accept as natural. The scientific method, the study of ethics, the structure of argument, the analysis of drama, all trace their lineage to Greek inquiry. They are no longer foreign ideas. They are simply part of how we understand the world. In art and architecture, Greek balance and proportion continue to guide. From city halls to universities, from courtyards to concert halls, the columns and capitals of classical design remain. But more than their form, it is the philosophy of form, the search for harmony, the respect for structure, the love of proportion that still shapes how we build and imagine. Even when modern styles diverge, the dialogue continues. In language, Greek roots run deep. Words like democracy, philosophy, aesthetic, and logic serve as foundations for modern thought. Even when not spoken, the ideas they carry remain close. In every law debated, every theory proposed, every painting considered for its beauty, the spirit of Greek inquiry is present, quiet but constant. But perhaps the most universal legacy of Greece lies in its belief in human potential, the idea that a person, through reason and effort, can come to understand something true. This belief, though challenged across time by fear, by control, by doubt, remains one of the most hopeful ideas humanity has ever embraced. To think, to question, to learn, these are not acts reserved for the elite or the chosen. They are part of what it means to be human. This was the radical vision of Greece, and it remains radical still. And yet, it is not only reason that Greece offers, it is also feeling, the deep, often painful, recognition that life is fragile, that beauty is fleeting, and that joy and sorrow walk always side by side. The tragedies of Sophocles, the epics of Homer, the hymns sung in echoing sanctuaries, all remind us that to live well is not to escape suffering, but to find meaning within it. This emotional clarity, this quiet bravery in the face of fate, is perhaps one of the most lasting gifts of the Greek tradition. Today, as people around the world face challenges both ancient and new, inequality, conflict, uncertainty, change, the legacy of Greece does not offer solutions, but it offers something softer and perhaps more enduring, a way of thinking, a way of listening, a way of seeing ourselves as part of a longer story. It invites us to step back from noise and haste, to consider what truly matters: justice, compassion, friendship, wisdom, beauty and truth. These are not Greek values alone. They are human values. But it was Greece that gave them shape, gave them language, gave them stage and structure and song. In this way, Greece belongs to all of us. To the artist in Mexico City sketching the line of a figure, to the student in Seoul reading Plato under dim light, to the scientist in Nairobi designing a careful experiment, to the elder in a New York cafe telling a grandchild a story of gods and monsters and mortals trying their best. The name may be Greece, but the legacy is shared, and so we carry it forward, in minds and hands, in buildings and books, in the soft decisions we make each day, to live with more care, more clarity, more depth. We carry it not as a burden, but as a quiet companion, a memory not of what we were, but of what we are still becoming. In the next section, we begin to draw this long, gentle journey toward its final reflection, honoring the timelessness of the Greek spirit and the way it continues to shape not just history, but the quiet interior lives of all who encounter it. There are civilizations that shape the world through conquest. Others leave their mark through trade, religion, or invention. But Greece, ancient, fragmented, and modest in size, left something softer, something more enduring. It gave the world a way of seeing, a habit of questioning, and a language of beauty that continues to breathe in the quiet spaces of human imagination. Its greatest power was not in its armies or its gold, but in the lives of its thinkers, poets, and citizens, and in the flame they kindled, one that has never quite gone out. In the deepest sense, Greece was always more than a place. It was a conversation, a dialogue between reason and wonder, between body and soul, between the world as it is and the world as it might be. That dialogue continues, not only in the halls of universities or the shelves of libraries, but in the quiet thoughts of ordinary people asking timeless questions. What is the good life? What is justice? What is love? What does it mean to be free? These questions do not belong to any one era. They reappear again and again, reshaped by time but always familiar. When a modern poet writes of longing, when a scientist pursues knowledge with careful patience, when a citizen speaks out for fairness, they continue a tradition that stretches back to Greek shores, to the shaded porches of philosophers, the open air of the agora, the footpaths of lonely thinkers walking through olive groves with furrowed brows and hopeful minds. In mythology, Greece offered not answers, but metaphors, timeless mirrors of the human experience. The story of Odysseus is not only a tale of monsters and storms, but a meditation on perseverance and homecoming. The tragedy of Oedipus is not just fate in motion, but a reminder of the limits of knowledge and the cost of pride. Even the gods, with all their beauty and flaws, reflect something deeply human, a world where desire and duty clash, where joy is fleeting, and where love is both salvation and sorrow. These myths remain with us not because they are old, but because they are true, not literally, but emotionally. They remind us that each life, no matter how ordinary, carries within it the shape of an epic. We all wander, struggle, fall, and rise. We all love and lose. We all seek meaning. In philosophy, Greece gave form to the invisible, to ethics, metaphysics, logic. It taught that to be human is not only to feel, but to reflect. The Socratic method remains a model of humility, the understanding that wisdom begins by admitting what we do not know. This humility is radical, even today. In a world of noise and certainty, to pause and consider, to question kindly and listen deeply, is itself a revolutionary act. In art and architecture, Greece taught us to see, to notice the balance of line and curve, the relationship between part and whole. It gave us proportion, not only in buildings but in thought. The Parthenon, with its deliberate asymmetries and gentle slopes, is not a symbol of perfection, but of care. A building made to align with the eye, not with strict geometry. It is a reminder that beauty arises not from control, but from harmony. This aesthetic legacy lives on not only in museums, but in moments, in the grace of a dancer's motion, in the gentle curve of a handwritten letter, in the design of everyday objects shaped to please the hand and eye. It lives in the belief that the things we make can lift the spirit, that art is not a luxury, but a form of truth. In democracy, Greece planted a fragile seed, imperfect, limited, but filled with potential. It showed the world that power could be shared, that law could be debated, and that citizenship was not a gift, but a responsibility. Today's democratic systems, with all their complexity and compromise, still echo that early hope. When citizens gather to vote, when laws are argued in open courts, when voices are raised in protest or in praise, the spirit of the Greek assembly lives on, not in its form but in its faith, that human beings can shape their own fate. This is the deepest thread of the Greek legacy, possibility, the belief that human life, despite its limitations, can be noble, that the world, despite its suffering, can be understood, that wisdom, though elusive, can be pursued. Greece never claimed perfection. It offered instead a way of striving toward truth, toward beauty, toward the good. And so the Greek spirit endures, not loudly, but with quiet strength. It lives in libraries and cafes, in classrooms and courtrooms, in the spaces where people pause to think, to remember, to imagine. It lives in the ache for justice and the joy of discovery, in the sound of ancient names spoken by modern tongues, in the way light falls across stone steps in the early morning, in the way a child learns to ask why. It lives too in the resilience of the Greek people today, in the laughter that fills their homes, in the generosity shown to strangers, in the songs sung at weddings and wakes alike. It lives in the diaspora, in the scattered communities where heritage is kept, not as a relic, but as a rhythm. It lives in the ways we all, knowingly or not, carry fragments of Greece with us, in our words, our values, our dreams. To honor Greece is not to idolize the past. It is to recognize that we are still part of its unfolding, still writing new verses in the long poem of civilization. Each of us, in seeking truth, in creating beauty, in practicing kindness, adds something to that legacy. We do not need to walk the streets of Athens to feel it. We need only to pause, to listen, to ask the next question with care. In the next section, we draw our journey gently toward its final reflections, offering thanks for the path we've walked and for the wisdom that walks still beside us. There are stories that do not end, but simply settle, like light resting on water, like the hush of dusk settling across the hills. The journey through ancient Greece is one of those stories. It does not conclude with a final moment or a fixed date. It closes more like a circle than a line, bringing us back not to where we began, but to something gently familiar, the sense that we have been in the presence of something quiet and enduring, something human. The landscape lingers. The sea, blue and endless, touching the shores of 1,000 islands, the wind in the olive groves, the crickets calling in the late warmth of evening, the stones of long-ruined temples, worn soft by rain and time, but still standing, the colors of the sunset mirrored on marble, gold fading into rose. These images are not only of a place, but of a way of being, attentive, rooted, aware. The voices linger too. Not only the grand ones, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, but the countless others who lived without monuments. the women who spun and sang, the artisans who shaped clay into stories, the farmers who watched the sky for signs of rain, the children who learned words older than their parents' names. Their lives, though lost to record, shaped the very texture of what we've called Greek. Their footsteps are in every threshold. Their laughter once echoed through the courtyards of towns we now study only in maps. What remains is not just their thought, but their presence, a presence that still touches the way we imagine the world. Greece gave us no single answer, but it gave us the love of seeking, a desire to look deeper, to think longer, to speak clearly and feel fully. In a world so often shaped by urgency, this gift is quiet and precious. It's in the curve of a well-written sentence, in the structure of a fair debate, in the careful balance of form and feeling in a piece of art, in the way a question can lead not to resolution, but to wonder. The legacy of Greece is not heavy. It is light. It moves with us, in our thoughts, in our speech, in the way we live with one another, seeking order not to control but to understand. And perhaps that is where its truest power lies, not in conquest, not in marble, but in harmony. In the attempt to bring together seeming opposites, reason and emotion, tradition and change, body and soul, the fleeting and the eternal. Ancient Greece never denied the complexity of the world. Instead, it gave us tools to live with that complexity, to make meaning, to create beauty, to act with integrity. Even now, that harmony calls to us, not as command, but as invitation. In a world of speed and fragmentation, it suggests a slower rhythm, a different pace. It reminds us that life, too, is an art form. That time is not always best measured by clocks, but by how fully we dwell in the present. That memory can be a guide. That thought can be an offering. To spend time with Greece is to remember that wisdom is not a possession. It is a practice, a path, not a monument we gaze at from afar, but a garden we return to, season after season, sometimes to learn, sometimes just to be. And so we leave this journey not with a conclusion, but with a kind of peaceful carrying, as if each word, each image, each name has left behind a small light to guide us. The light of the mind, the light of the heart. Greece in the end was never just a place. It was and is a way of seeing, a way of walking through the world with depth, dignity, and care. There is more to come. 2 sections remain, but now we rest for a moment, in the quiet after knowing, in the calm after the question, in the soft glow of a civilization that, though ancient, still holds out its hand, offering not certainty, but companionship. In the next section we return to the theme of the journey, exploring how the Greek experience, in all its dimensions, can offer us a gentle mirror for our own lives, wherever we may be. Some stories change us not through plot, but through reflection. They do not direct us to answers, but draw us into deeper questions, questions that stay with us, settle quietly in the corners of the mind, and return when we least expect them. The story of ancient Greece is one of these. It begins as history, moves through philosophy and poetry, and ends softly, unexpectedly, in the self. To walk through Greece's past is to encounter not only cities and ideas, but patterns of thought that mirror the patterns of being human. In every generation, people have asked the same things. Who am I? What should I do? What is love? What does it mean to live well? The Greeks asked these questions aloud, often in public, often with no resolution. They did not always agree. Their answers were flawed, evolving, incomplete. But they believed, with a kind of quiet defiance, that asking mattered. This belief can change how we live. When we read the dialogues of Plato, We hear not only Socrates and his companions, but ourselves, moving between certainty and doubt, wrestling with words, discovering the limits of what we thought we knew. These conversations, though shaped by a distant world, are strangely intimate. They speak to moments of personal uncertainty, when values collide, when choices are unclear, when the soul feels restless. The dialogue, in the end, becomes internal. And that is where the Greek tradition becomes more than a subject. It becomes a practice. The philosopher Epictetus, born into slavery and hardship, taught that external events are beyond our control, but our response is always our own. In his words, we find a mirror not of ancient empire, but of modern anxiety. We hear, across time, an invitation to step back, to breathe, to choose with intention. His ideas were not for the privileged, they were for anyone navigating uncertainty, quietly, inwardly, daily. The same can be said of Aristotle, whose ethics were not a call to perfection, but a gentle push toward balance, toward the golden mean between excess and deficiency. Courage for him was not the absence of fear, but the moderation of it. Generosity was not about grand gestures, but the right gift, in the right way, at the right time. His was a philosophy of patience, one that asked us to shape our lives, not through rules, but through habits of character. Today, in a world of extremes, that quiet search for balance still feels like a balm. And then there is the timeless resonance of myth, not as fantasy, but as deep emotional truth. The grief of Orpheus, who looks back and loses what he loves. The pride of Achilles, who must choose between glory and peace. The curiosity of Pandora, the persistence of Penelope, the loneliness of Prometheus. Each story a symbol, each character a facet of something we carry. Myth allows us to feel without explanation. It holds the parts of us that logic cannot soothe. It gives shape to feeling. In many ways, this is the soul of Greece, a culture that did not separate the rational from the poetic, the intellectual from the emotional. It allowed thought and feeling to walk side by side. This is not always how we are taught to live, but it may be how we are meant to live, integrated, whole, honest. Even the structure of Greek tragedy, with its chorus and catharsis, was never about despair. It was about seeing clearly. The stage was a place for reckoning, with loss, with guilt, with fate, and through that reckoning, the audience was offered a form of release. Today we experience this in quieter ways, a film that makes us cry, a novel that makes us reflect, a conversation that softens something inside us. These, too, are modern forms of catharsis. Greece teaches us not to avoid these moments, but to honor them. There is a reason why the ruins of Greece feel alive, why a single broken column can move a visitor to silence, why the language, even when half understood, feels familiar. It is not nostalgia, it is recognition. The Greeks knew that life is short, that beauty fades, that the mind grows old but still seeks meaning. They honored this not with fear, but with expression, through sculpture, through drama, through philosophy and ritual. They lived with mortality and still made art. They saw the limits of knowledge and still asked questions. They loved the world not because it was eternal, but because it was fleeting. That, perhaps, is the most personal lesson of all: to live attentively, to eat slowly, to speak kindly, to listen deeply, to find joy in small things, in a breeze through an open window, in the shadow of a tree at midday, in the company of a thoughtful friend. These are not grand ideals, they are daily ones, but they are no less sacred. The Greeks believed that excellence could be found in the ordinary, when lived with virtue and care, and when we do this, when we live not perfectly, but attentively, we continue their legacy. Not in marble or manuscript, but in the soft architecture of our inner lives. In the way we hold grief, in the way we cultivate thought, in the way we navigate relationships with compassion and courage, Greece remains with us not only because we remember it, but because we become it. Each time we engage in honest dialogue, each time we search for meaning, each time we see beauty and feel something shift within us. The story we have followed is vast, but its impact is often small, and that is where it is most powerful. It does not change everything at once. It changes the way we see, and from that, slowly, quietly, life itself begins to feel different, not easier, but fuller. In the final section, we bring this journey to its close. Not by saying goodbye to Greece, but by acknowledging that it never truly leaves us. Like light falling through leaves, it remains, soft, steady, and always near. Some journeys do not end when we stop walking. They continue inward, into thought, into memory, into the quiet spaces of daily life. The journey through ancient Greece is one of those. It begins with names and dates, with gods and heroes, with marble and myth. But by the time it reaches its final steps, it has become something else, something interior, something personal, something timeless. We have walked through centuries, from the scattered villages of the Bronze Age to the golden streets of Athens, from the rise of Macedon to the long breath of Byzantium, from the fragile rebirth of a modern state to the living presence of Greece today. We have crossed oceans with the Diaspora, followed ideas across cultures, and watched Greek thought ripple through the centuries like soft rings on water. And now, at this final threshold, we do not ask what more there is to learn. We ask instead how to carry what we've gathered, not in our hands, but in our hearts. Because Greece, for all its monuments and manuscripts, was never about the past. It was about how to live. It asked with uncommon clarity what it means to be a human being in a world of change, to be fragile and strong, joyful and mortal, grounded and aspiring. That question, once spoken in stone amphitheaters and shaded gardens, now belongs to each of us. In a quiet way, it always has. When we listen to music and feel something ancient stir, when we stand before a painting and find ourselves held in stillness, when we open a book and see ourselves in a character written thousands of years ago, these are Greek moments. Not because they are about Greece, but because they were shaped by a worldview that placed the human experience, its complexity, its contradictions, its beauty, at the center of meaning. This is what has made the legacy of Greece so enduring. It is not bound to a place or a people. It is a kind of light, a way of seeing, a habit of asking gently, of shaping carefully, of living with the understanding that even fleeting things, words, gestures, thoughts, can be vessels of truth. The Greek philosophers called this Aristotle, excellence not in dominance, but in alignment. In being fully what something is meant to be. A tree that grows straight, a pot that holds water well, a person who lives with integrity, guided by both heart and reason. Aristotle was not about greatness. It was about harmony. Today, that ideal lives quietly in us. When we do work that feels meaningful, when we act with kindness, even when no one is watching, when we choose balance over excess, dialogue over noise, simplicity over spectacle, these are not grand acts, but they are enduring ones. They are the kind that shape a life. In times of uncertainty, Greece offers something deeper than nostalgia. It offers orientation, not a map, but a compass. It reminds us that complexity can be met with thought, that sorrow can live beside beauty. That time is not only something to measure, but something to experience. And in this sense, to know Greece even just a little is to know a part of ourselves. A part that is thoughtful, a part that is creative, a part that is drawn toward meaning. Perhaps that is why the ruins still move us, why a fragment of poetry or a weathered statue can bring us to tears. We are not looking at history, we are recognizing something, a kinship, a voice we didn't know we had been listening for, and we are not alone in that recognition. Across the world, in many languages and lands, people have felt it too. A writer in Chile, a musician in Korea, a teacher in Ghana, a sculptor in Finland. The influence of Greece is not a line drawn outward from one place. It is a quiet constellation, scattered, luminous, shared, each point, a person, a question, a work of art, a decision made with care. That is the true monument of Greece, not the Parthenon, not the preserved texts, not even the great names carved into memory. It is the unfolding of its spirit in lives still being lived. The thoughtful glance, the just word, the work done with attention, the dream that balances what is and what might be. And so we end here, not with a farewell, but with a soft continuation. In the morning light that filters through classroom windows, in the stillness before a performance begins, in the quiet between questions, in the hush of evening, when we look inward and ask ourselves if we have lived well, spoken honestly, cared enough. Greece walks with us in these moments, not as a voice from the past, but as a companion in the present. And as you drift now into thought, into memory, into sleep, know that the journey is not over. It is simply quieter, a long breath, a turning inward. The ancient world has given what it could, and what remains is yours, to carry, to share, to live. May your questions be gentle, may your days be balanced, may your nights bring you peace, and may the old light of Greece stay with you, like a lamp softly lit, always near, always glowing.